There is a bottle in the story I want to tell you tonight. Small, orange, ordinary. The kind of bottle that sat on bathroom shelves and kitchen windowsills and inside the little wooden medicine cabinets that every respectable home in 1959 had mounted beside the bathroom mirror. The label was clean and white, and the name printed on it was long and pharmaceutical and meant absolutely nothing. The pills inside were small and white and tasteless. Women took them in the morning with a glass of water, or sometimes with the first sip of tea, and within an hour or so the sickness that had been rolling through them since before dawn, the particular grinding nausea of early pregnancy tea, would simply stop, would go quiet, would leave them standing at the kitchen sink in a body that felt, for once, like something they could manage. That is the beginning of the story. The middle is harder to tell calmly, but we will get there. We always get there. Before we go any further, I want you to get comfortable. Whatever position you're in right now, go ahead and adjust it. Fluff that pillow if it needs fluffing. Pull the blanket up if it has slipped. Find the version of horizontal that works best for you and stay there for a moment, just breathing. If this voice is doing what it is supposed to do, if it is settling you down rather than winding you up, please consider leaving a like on this video or subscribing if you have not already. I post stories like this most weeks, and your being here genuinely keeps the channel going. Tell me where you are tonight. Tell me what time it somehow already is. It is always later than anyone expects, and you are always exactly where you are supposed to be. Now let us go back to 1954, to a small company in the town of Stolberg, in the northwestern corner of West Germany, to a bottle of white tablets that had not yet been made, had not yet been named, and had certainly not yet been given to a single pregnant woman on Earth. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. West Germany, in the early 1950s, was a country that had made a decision. Not a formal decision, not the kind written in treaties or announced from podiums, but the kind that a place makes collectively, quietly, in the space between what happened and what comes next. The decision was to rebuild. And rebuilding, in the particular language of that moment, meant moving forward so consistently and with such concentrated energy that the things directly behind you eventually fell below the horizon line of what could be comfortably seen. The cities were going back up. There were still gaps in the skylines of Cologne and Hamburg and Frankfurt where buildings had been, where walls still stood with the windows blackened and the staircases leading to nothing but open air. But the pace of new construction was extraordinary. The economic recovery that would later be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was already beginning in these years, driven by Marshall Plan support and West German industry, and the particular focused energy of a population that had decided with some urgency to get back to work. There were things not to think about, and there were apartments to furnish and children to feed, and the future, however uncertain, was where the effort was going. The effort was immense. In this atmosphere of reconstruction and forward motion and the particular relief of ordinary life resuming, the pharmaceutical industry found itself in a position of unusual cultural authority. Modern medicine in the early 1950s was not yet the complicated, ambivalent thing it would later become. It was still largely the thing it had been during the war years and the years just before, a source of genuine wonder, a domain where real and measurable progress was occurring at a pace that felt, to those living through it, almost miraculous. And that was not entirely wrong. Progress was occurring. The antibiotics were the centerpiece of this wonder. Penicillin had moved from the laboratory to the battlefield and then to the ordinary doctor's office in the space of a decade, and what it had accomplished was genuinely transformative in a way that earlier generations could not have imagined. Infections that had been death sentences were now nuisances. Surgical procedures that had been impossibly risky were now routine. Children who would have died of scarlet fever or rheumatic fever or the particular bacterial miseries that the 19th century had carried as a matter of course were now simply not dying. The same science that had produced these achievements was producing more. New compounds, new applications, new categories of drug that seemed to arrive almost faster than the conditions that might require them. The vocabulary of pharmaceutical optimism had a brightness to it that was almost physical. Progress, modern medicine, the future arriving faster than expected. Into this climate, in the unremarkable town of Stolberg in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in the industrial northwest of West Germany, a company called Chemie Grünenthal was finding its footing. Stolberg is a small city set among the low hills near Aachen and the Belgian border. It had a history in metalworking and manufacturing that predated the pharmaceutical era by centuries. The Rhineland was industrial in its bones, and Stolberg had always made things. Its post-war recovery was, like the recovery of most of the region, a matter of practical momentum. The factories reopened, the people came back, the rhythms of production reasserted themselves with the reliability of habit. The company that would become one of the most consequential pharmaceutical manufacturers of the 20th century had not begun as a pharmaceutical company at all. Chemie Grünenthal had its origins in the manufacture of soaps, toiletries, and household chemicals, the unglamorous but necessary products of domestic life. Its founder was a man named Hermann Wirtz, who had built a modest business in the region and who possessed, alongside whatever other qualities he had, a clear-eyed awareness of where the opportunities in post-war commerce were presenting themselves. The soap business was fine. The pharmaceutical business was where the money was going. The pivot to pharmaceuticals was not unique to Grünenthal. Across West Germany, companies with manufacturing infrastructure and chemical expertise were looking at the pharmaceutical sector and seeing what was plainly there to see: a rapidly expanding market, relatively few established domestic competitors, and a regulatory environment that had not yet developed the kind of institutional scrutiny that would characterize the industry in later decades. The basic requirements for entering this market were a facility, a laboratory, a sales force, and something to sell. The depth of scientific rigor behind the something to sell was not, in the early 1950s, the primary consideration. It was not that no one cared. It was that the frameworks for caring had not yet been built. Grünenthal had achieved some early success with antibiotics, which gave it a foothold in the professional pharmaceutical market and a network of relationships with the physicians who wrote prescriptions across West Germany. It had a sales force. It had, by the mid-1950s, the bones of a serious company. What it needed, in the way that all pharmaceutical companies of that era needed, was a new product. A product that was not another antibiotic. The antibiotic market was becoming crowded. The large established companies were dominant in that space. But something different, something that would sell well, be prescribed widely, and address a genuine human need. In 1954, a chemist at Grünenthal's laboratories named Wilhelm Kunz synthesized a new compound. It had been developed in the general direction of an antihistamine, something for allergies, but the initial testing suggested it was not particularly effective for that purpose. What it did do, quite reliably, was produce sedation. Animals given the compound in the laboratory became calm. They grew still. In the language of the laboratory, they tolerated the compound remarkably well. And in the pharmaceutical company in Stolberg that was looking for its next product, the word remarkable attached itself to a specific finding that seemed, at the time, almost too good to be true. The finding was this. In the standard pre-market testing of that era, researchers administered a compound in increasing doses to test animals, looking for the dose that would be lethal to 50% of the animals, the LD50, a standard metric of acute toxicity. For most compounds, this dose could be established. For some, it required quite large quantities, but for the new compound from Grünenthal's laboratory, the lethal dose could not be established at all. The mice were given enormous quantities. The rats were given far more than any plausible therapeutic dose. The dogs survived. The rabbits survived. The compound did not kill them. It sedated them sometimes, but it did not kill them. To the scientists conducting these tests, in 1954, this finding was not a mystery requiring further investigation. It was proof of safety. Here was a sedative that you could apparently not overdose a rat on. The barbiturates, the sleeping pills then in common use, had a very well-known and very real capacity to kill in overdose, and this was a genuine clinical problem. Contergan offered the possibility of a sleeping pill without that risk. The logic seemed airtight. The logic was, in a very specific and ultimately catastrophic way, incomplete. What the testing did not ask, what the entire framework of pharmaceutical safety evaluation in 1954 did not yet require anyone to ask, was what the compound might do to a developing organism, what it might do to an embryo, forming its fundamental structures in the first weeks of existence. what it might do if it crossed from a mother's bloodstream into the body of a child that was in the process of becoming. Teratogenicity testing, the systematic evaluation of what a drug might do to a developing fetus, was not yet a standard part of pre-market pharmaceutical evaluation. This was not a failure unique to Grünenthal. It was a gap that existed across the entire pharmaceutical landscape, across countries and companies and regulatory frameworks. The placenta was widely understood to be a protective barrier. The developing embryo was assumed to be, in some diffuse way, shielded from the chemical world of its mother. These beliefs were not malicious. They were simply wrong, and the wrongness had not yet been demonstrated. There is something else in the history of Chemie Grünenthal that belongs in the story, and that I will state carefully because it deserves care. One of the men who served on Grünenthal's advisory board during the company's pharmaceutical expansion was a chemist named Otto Ambros, who had been convicted at the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1947 for his role in organizing the use of concentration camp inmates as slave labor at a synthetic rubber facility. Ambros had served a portion of his sentence, and then, in the way that the early Federal Republic of Germany accommodated certain men with certain histories, re-entered professional life. He became an advisor to Grünenthal and to other West German chemical enterprises. His presence on Grünenthal's board is a documented historical fact. What it means requires more care. It does not prove that Grünenthal's specific testing failures were the product of Nazi-era thinking. The failures were not unique to Grünenthal, they were systemic. But it adds a specific and uncomfortable texture to the portrait of the organization that would bring Contergan to the world. On the 1st of October 1957, the compound that had been given the generic name Thalidomide and the West German brand name Contergan went on sale in West Germany. It was available without a prescription. You could walk into a pharmacy in any town in the country, hand over a modest sum of marks, and carry away the small box of tablets that Grünenthal had spent 3 years preparing to sell. No doctor's appointment, no prescription pad, just the over-the-counter availability of a product that the company had satisfied itself and the West German regulatory apparatus had not significantly challenged, was safe. The marketing was clear and consistent and enormously confident. Promotional materials described Contergan as the first truly safe sleeping pill. Safe for adults, safe for children, safe for the whole family. That last phrase, which appeared in some of the early literature with the casualness of an afterthought, is one of those details that reads now with a particular quality of historical unease. A sedative described as safe for the whole family, as though it were a brand of soap. As though safety were a finished and proven thing rather than a question that the available testing had only partially asked. The sales were strong from the beginning. West Germany in 1957 contained, as every country always contains, a large number of people who could not sleep. People carrying the nameless residue of the previous decade in ways that had no proper diagnosis and that manifested regularly as insomnia or anxiety or the general condition that the era's physicians called nervous exhaustion. The barbiturate sleeping pills that had been available to these people carried a well-known and genuinely frightening risk of overdose. The newspapers had covered the deaths, people knew, and so a sleeping pill that promised genuine rest without that risk occupied a real and waiting place in the market. Within 2 years, Contergan was one of the best-selling drugs in West Germany. The sales representatives who visited doctors' offices across the country with samples and materials were reporting success. The over-the-counter figures were impressive. The company's revenues were growing. Grünenthal had found its product, and its product was working. Grünenthal, watching the figures and watching the market, began to think internationally. The licensing agreements followed quickly. A company would acquire the rights to manufacture and sell thalidomide in their country in exchange for fees. And in each country, the drug would be given a local brand name, adapted to local market sensibilities, while the central claim, safety, unprecedented safety, safety that the animal testing had apparently demonstrated beyond doubt, remained constant. The United Kingdom acquired the license through Distillers Company, Biochemicals, Limited, a firm perhaps better known for its production of Scotch whisky, which would market the drug under the brand name Distaval. Canada's license went to Frank W. Horner Limited. Australia received the drug through the Distillers arrangement. In the United States, a Cincinnati company called Richardson Merrill held the license and was preparing an application to the Food and Drug Administration under the brand name Kevadon. Across South America, Europe, and Asia, additional licensing deals brought the drug into more than 40 countries, under more than 40 different names, in a network of commercial relationships that was, by the late 1950s, of considerable scale and considerable momentum. Softenin in Spain, Sedative in Brazil, Polygripen in Portugal, Noxidin in Canada, Isomin in Japan. The names varied, the marketing varied, but the central claim was the same across every market. This drug was safe, safer than what had come before, safer than the alternatives, safe in a way that modern medicine had not previously achieved in this category of products. And in the pharmacies of West Germany and Britain and Australia and dozens of other countries, the small boxes were arranged on the shelves, the sales figures were logged, the licensing fees arrived at the Stolberg offices. The company that had begun by making soap was making one of the best-selling drugs in the world, and the world was receiving it with the kind of uncomplicated trust that the 1950s extended to pharmaceutical progress in general. There was no reason from inside the story as it was being told at that moment to expect anything other than continued success. The bottle on the pharmacy shelf was small and ordinary and offered to anyone who walked in and asked for it. It had been put there by people who believed in the specific and limited meaning of the available evidence that they had been thorough. The question of what evidence the available tests had been thorough about and what evidence they had never thought to gather was a question that would be answered in the only way such questions sometimes are, through consequences, through the outcomes of the test that had never been run because no one had thought to ask for it, through the ordinary accumulation of ordinary mornings in ordinary kitchens across a world that believed in the drug on the shelf. What I want you to understand about Stolberg and about Grünenthal and about the West Germany of the middle 1950s more generally is the particular texture of the confidence that pervaded that world, not the arrogance of people who believe they can do anything, something quieter than arrogance, the confidence of people who have survived a catastrophe and who are building something afterward and who have decided, perhaps because the alternative is not livable, to build it with their faces turned firmly toward what is ahead rather than what is behind. The pharmaceutical industry was part of this forward-facing project. It was one of the things being built, and the building was happening fast, which meant that some of the questions that slower building would have generated were not being asked. The drug that would become Contergan was synthesized in Grünenthal's Stolberg laboratory in the summer of 1954 by a team that included the chemist Wilhelm Kunz and colleagues. The initial testing began in animals within the year. The question being asked of the compound was essentially, does it do anything useful and does it appear to do anything dangerous? The first answer was promising. Sedation, clean and reliable. The second answer was the one that appeared to settle the matter. Animals given the compound in doses far exceeding any plausible therapeutic range did not die. They slept. They were sedated in a way that looked from the outside like what you wanted a sleeping pill to look like, and they woke up again. The conclusion that the company drew from this was the conclusion that the science of the era supported. The drug was safe. Specifically, the drug did not have an acute lethal dose that could be established in standard animal testing. This was, in the pharmacological understanding of the period, the primary measure of safety, and the primary risk being guarded against was the risk that had given the barbiturates their dark reputation, the risk that someone could, accidentally or otherwise, take too many and not wake up. Contergan appeared to eliminate this risk entirely. The promotional language was not invented whole cloth. It reflected a real finding, interpreted according to a framework that was incomplete in ways that had not yet been revealed. The West German regulatory system that evaluated Contergan before its launch in 1957 was not the same kind of institution that the FDA would become. The Bundesgesundheitsamt, the Federal Health Office, existed and had responsibilities, but the pre-market review process for new drugs in 1957 West Germany was considerably less rigorous than what Grünenthal would later face from Francis Kelsey in Washington. The drug was registered, it was approved for sale. The documentation that supported the approval was what the company provided, evaluated by an agency that did not have the resources or the mandate to conduct independent investigation of what the company had submitted. This was normal. It was also, as the story of Contergan demonstrates with particular clarity, not adequate. In the months following Contergan's launch, the sales representatives moved through their territories with the material that Grünenthal had prepared for them, visiting surgeries and clinics, leaving samples and literature. having the conversations that were meant to establish the relationships that would generate prescriptions. The physicians they visited were busy people, as physicians always are, with patient lists and administrative obligations and the continuous background pressure of a profession that never quite produces enough time for the things it requires. The representative who arrived with clear information and a free sample and a friendly manner was a convenience in the genuine sense. He made it possible for a physician to know about a new product without having to find the time to read about it independently. The information environment of the physician's practice in 1958 was, in this respect, substantially shaped by the companies whose products the physician was being asked to prescribe. By 1959, Contergan had become sufficiently well established in the West German market that the question of its safety had ceased to feel like an open question. It had become, in the informal but powerful sense of medical convention, settled. Physicians prescribed it without the kind of careful consideration they might have given to a new and untested drug, because in their understanding the testing had been done, the drug had been in use for 2 years without obvious catastrophe, and the evidence of its effectiveness was accumulating in their own practices. Their patients were sleeping better. Their patients were tolerating the drug well. The system was producing the outcome that systems producing it tend to report: confirmation. What the system was not designed to notice, and this is not a question of individual failure but of structural design, was the thing that was happening inside a different population of patients, at a different scale of biology, in the dark interior of early pregnancies that were proceeding otherwise normally. The pharmacies were selling their stock, the receipts were being logged, the detail men were meeting their targets. And in kitchens and bathrooms across West Germany and, increasingly, the rest of the developed world, the morning tablets were being taken. I want to linger on the Otto Ambros detail for a moment because it is the kind of detail that tends to be mentioned once in accounts of this story and then set aside, and I think it deserves slightly more than a passing mention. Ambros was a chemist, a very good one by all professional accounts, who had served as an executive at IG Farben during the Second World War, where he had been responsible for, among other things, the construction and management of a synthetic rubber and fuel plant at Auschwitz using forced labor provided by the camp's prisoner population. He had been convicted at the Nuremberg trials in 1948 of mass murder and slavery, sentenced to 8 years, and released in 1951 as part of a general commutation of war crime sentences that the American High Commissioner John McCloy authorized across a range of defendants. By the mid-1950s, he was serving on the advisory board of Chemie Grünenthal. The presence of a Nuremberg convicted war criminal on the advisory board of the company that produced thalidomide is sometimes treated as a biographical curiosity, and sometimes treated as evidence of a direct moral lineage between the crimes of the war and the crimes of the pharmaceutical disaster. Neither treatment is quite right. Ambros's specific role at Grünenthal was in chemistry and production, not in the medical or regulatory decisions that led to the disaster. His presence on the board does not establish a causal connection between his wartime history and the teratogenicity of Contergan. What his presence does establish, and why it belongs in a full account of the story, is something about the West German industrial world of the 1950s and its relationship to its own recent past. A man who had been convicted at Nuremberg was, by the mid-1950s, a valued industrial consultant in West Germany. This was not an exceptional or scandalous situation in the circles in which he operated. It was, in the specific and uncomfortable sense, normal. The West German economic recovery, which was real and substantial and in many respects remarkable, drew on the expertise and networks of people who had served the previous regime in various capacities, and the mechanisms for excluding that expertise and those networks were not, in practice, applied with any consistency. This context does not explain thalidomide, but it explains something about the culture in which thalidomide was produced and sold, a culture that had decided, at the level of industrial practice, that certain kinds of accountability could be deferred in the service of economic reconstruction. The pharmaceutical disaster that followed was not caused by that culture exactly, but it was, in some sense, permitted by it, enabled by an environment in which the impulse to push forward, to build and sell and grow, was stronger than the impulse to ask whether the building was being done carefully enough. Let me tell you about how a drug becomes a belief. There is a particular process that happens in pharmaceutical marketing that has nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with language. A compound is synthesized and tested and approved and brought to market, and then something else begins, something about image and repetition and the careful cultivation of the particular kind of trust that eventually stops being evaluated and becomes simply assumed. It is not always cynical, this process. The people writing the marketing materials often genuinely believe in what they are selling. The sales representatives who visit physicians' offices with their samples and their brochures and their professional warmth often have real enthusiasm for the product they are describing. The line between conviction and salesmanship is, in the pharmaceutical industry as in others, not always easy to find. Thalidomide's arrival in the market, as Contergan in West Germany, as Distaval in the United Kingdom, under other names in other countries, was accompanied by a marketing campaign built around a single, repeated, carefully chosen claim. The claim was safety, not efficacy, though efficacy was certainly implied and broadly demonstrated. The central selling proposition, the phrase that appeared again and again in the promotional literature and in the conversations between pharmaceutical representatives and physicians, was the claim that this compound was uniquely, remarkably, unprecedented in the history of sleeping pills safe. The West German promotional materials used language that translated approximately to this: completely safe even for pregnant women and nursing mothers. The British materials for Distaval used similar phrasing. In some of the international marketing that reached physicians' offices across Europe and the wider world, the word safe appeared so frequently and with such sustained conviction that it ceased to function as an adjective describing a quality and became instead a kind of identity. You were not prescribing a sedative, you were prescribing safety itself. This was powerful marketing. It was powerful in the obvious commercial sense. It differentiated the product from the barbiturates that it was replacing, and it differentiated it on exactly the dimension that mattered most to the physicians who were being asked to prescribe it, and to the patients who would take it. But it was also powerful in a subtler way, because it did something to the standard calculus of pharmaceutical suspicion. When a drug presents itself primarily on dimensions of efficacy, a physician can evaluate the efficacy. She can read the literature. She can assess the trial results. She can weigh the evidence and come to a view. When a drug presents itself primarily on safety, and the safety claim seems to rest on a specific and apparently verifiable finding that no lethal dose could be established in animal testing, the evaluation becomes different. Safety, when it is framed as an absence of obvious danger, is much harder to interrogate than a positive clinical claim. The detail men of the late 1950s were the human embodiment of this marketing. Detail men. The pharmaceutical representatives who visited physicians' offices bearing samples and literature and a friendly, collegial manner were a fixture of medical practice in that era, and they were very good at what they did. Their job was to establish relationships. Not transactional relationships. They were not precisely salesmen in the way that the word implies a transaction, but the kind of professional relationships that meant that when the moment arrived to choose between a familiar product and a new one, or between competing new products, the physician thought of the one whose representative had spent time in her office, had answered her questions, had known her name. The representative who visited a physician's surgery in 1958 or 1959 with information about Distaval or Contergan had a simple and consistent message. The drug works. It is safe. Your patients with insomnia will sleep better. Your patients with anxiety will be calmer. It is suitable for elderly patients for whom the barbiturates carried particular risks. It is suitable for children as a bedtime sedative. This was stated directly as a feature of the product. It is suitable for pregnant women who may be suffering from the sleeplessness and nausea that frequently accompany early pregnancy. That last phrase, suitable for pregnant women, is where the marketing became most directly dangerous, and it is worth slowing down to consider it. Because from the perspective of a physician in 1958 or 1959, the claim was not obviously reckless. It rested on the same foundation as all the other safety claims. The animal testing that had produced no lethal dose, the apparent absence of acute toxicity in any of the species tested, the accumulating clinical reports from physicians across West Germany who had prescribed the drug and had seen no obvious harm. The claim that the drug was safe for pregnant women was not a lie that everyone involved knew was a lie. It was an assertion that rested on the absence of evidence of harm, in a world that had not yet understood that the absence of evidence of harm and the actual absence of harm were two very different things. Let me tell you something about the medical literature that was circulating among physicians in those years, because it shaped what doctors knew and believed when they wrote the prescriptions that put thalidomide into the hands of pregnant women. Grünenthal and its licensing partners had developed a body of clinical literature supporting Contergan's safety and efficacy. This literature appeared in professional medical journals, real journals, peer-reviewed in the manner of the era, and it carried the weight that such journals always carry. Physicians read it. They incorporated it into their understanding of the product. The studies were conducted by real physicians reporting real observations, and the physicians who had written them were, in many cases, part of a network of consultants and investigators who had financial relationships with Grünenthal, either through consulting fees or through the pharmaceutical company's common practice of providing samples and materials to cooperative physicians. None of this was unique to Grünenthal. The cooperative physician network, the arrangement by which pharmaceutical companies provided financial support and samples to physicians who would prescribe their products and produce supportive clinical observations, was the standard practice of the era. It was not secret. It was how the system worked. But it meant that the clinical literature on Contergan was assembled with a friendliness to the desired outcome that made it poor evidence in the honest sense of the word. The studies tended to confirm what the marketing had already claimed. The adverse events that were beginning to accumulate, we will come to them, were not prominently featured. And there was another element to the marketing that operated at the level of pure cultural atmosphere. The late 1950s were years of what I can only describe as pharmaceutical faith. The antibiotics had worked. The vaccines were working. The polio vaccine had been announced in 1955, and its success was, at that moment in American and European culture, genuinely moving. Here was modern medicine doing exactly what modern medicine had promised, taking a disease that had paralyzed and killed children for generations and making it simply over. The mood in mainstream medicine and among the educated public that followed mainstream medicine was one of progress, of arrival, of technologies appearing precisely when they were needed. A new drug that was safe and effective and addressed a real human need fit perfectly into this narrative. Now let me come to the morning sickness application specifically, because it is here that the story of thalidomide becomes most directly the story of women, and because the specific way in which the drug came to be prescribed for morning sickness tells us something important about how the medical world of the late 1950s understood both pregnancy and the women who were pregnant. Morning sickness, the nausea and vomiting of early pregnancy, which is the correct clinical description since it does not confine itself to mornings and in its severe form is not reasonably described by the word sickness, which implies something mild and temporary, had been understood for centuries as an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of the first trimester. In the mid-20th century, this view was beginning to shift, and not always in helpful directions. There was a significant strand of medical thinking in that era that attributed the nausea of pregnancy at least partly to psychological causes, to ambivalence about the pregnancy, to unconscious anxiety, to the woman's mental and emotional state. This was not a fringe position. It appeared in reputable medical literature. It shaped the way some physicians framed the problem to their patients as something that might be addressed, at least in part, through the patient's attitude or her adjustment to her condition. Into this context, the availability of a drug that demonstrably relieved nausea offered physicians an alternative framing. Here was something concrete, something that could be prescribed, something that worked, and thalidomide did work for nausea. This is not in dispute. The anti-nausea effect was real, rather than requiring the patient to do the essentially impossible work of adjusting her psychology. For a physician who had a queasy, pregnant patient in his office, the ability to write a prescription and have something happen was considerably more satisfying than explaining that she might feel better if she could manage to feel differently about being pregnant. The anti-nausea application of thalidomide was not initially the primary focus of the drug's marketing. It was a sleeping pill, but the overlap between the categories of patient who needed sleep and the category of patient who was experiencing the exhaustion and nausea of early pregnancy was obvious to prescribing physicians, and the marketing expanded to include this use. By the late 1950s, in West Germany and in the United Kingdom and in Australia and elsewhere, thalidomide was being prescribed not only as a sleeping pill, but as a treatment for the nausea of early pregnancy. which meant, and this is the sentence that has an almost unbearable quality in retrospect, it was being given to the population most vulnerable to its hidden effects during the specific window of pregnancy when those effects would be most catastrophic. The critical period for thalidomide's damage to the developing embryo was narrow. It was the period of organogenesis, the formation of the major organ systems, and specifically the period from approximately day 20 to day 36 of gestation. This is the first trimester, the very beginning of the pregnancy. A woman who had not yet missed her period might be at risk. A woman who knew she was pregnant but had not yet had her first prenatal appointment might be at risk. The limbs form during this window. The ears, the heart, the specific structures that thalidomide would interrupt in its hidden action were forming during the weeks when a woman was most likely to take a drug for morning sickness, because morning sickness is a feature of the first trimester. But none of this was known. Not the critical window, not the mechanism, not the fact that thalidomide crossed the placental barrier with ease, entering the embryonic environment that the medical world of 1959 still largely believed was protected. The placenta was a filter. The embryo was safe inside it. These were the assumptions that the prescribing of thalidomide in early pregnancy rested upon. They were not assumptions that anyone had seriously tested because no one had thought they needed to be. The prescriptions were written, the bottles were dispensed. Women in the first trimester took the morning pill with their tea, the nausea quieted, the days became manageable. And in the pharmacies and the doctors' offices and the medical literature and the Grünenthal boardroom, the system that had produced the drug continued to function with the smooth confidence of a system that believed it was working correctly. Because in the most visible and most obvious sense, it was. The drug worked, the patients reported improvement, the sales figures confirmed it, the cooperative physician network produced supportive literature. The regulatory bodies of more than 40 countries had seen nothing that required them to intervene. The loop of information that connected the manufacturer to the prescribers to the patients was running cleanly in the direction that everyone in the loop preferred. The information that was not in the loop, the information that would have interrupted it, or might have, was scattered in places that the loop could not yet see. It was in the delivery rooms where, in 1959 and into 1960, physicians were beginning to encounter babies whose bodies were shaped in ways they had never seen before. It was in the filing systems of country doctors who had noted something unusual without yet having a context in which the unusual thing was meaningful. It was forming, slowly and without announcement, in the shape of a pattern that needed someone to stand back far enough to see it. The loop was still running. The loop would keep running for another 2 years, and in the meantime, the bottles were going onto the shelves, and the morning pills were being swallowed, and the nausea was quieting, and the world that had decided to believe in modern medicine was receiving exactly what it had asked for. Let me tell you something about what the word safe meant in a medical advertisement in 1958, because it is a word that was doing a great deal of work in that era, and not all of the work it was doing was visible. The safety claim for thalidomide rested, as we have established, on the animal testing that produced no lethal dose. But in the marketing materials that physicians received and that appeared in the medical journals, the claim was stated without this qualification. It was stated as a flat fact. The drug was safe. Period. Not safe within the limits of the tests conducted, not safe in the sense that no acute toxicity had been demonstrated, but safe comprehensively, absolutely, in a way that closed the question rather than opening it for professional evaluation. This rhetorical move from a qualified scientific finding to an unqualified marketing claim is one of the small and important steps through which the pharmaceutical industry of the late 1950s shaped the prescribing environment. No individual decision in the chain was necessarily a lie. The animal testing results were real. The absence of a lethal dose was a genuine finding. The claim that this finding supported was a normal feature of pharmaceutical marketing in that era, but the gap between what the evidence showed and what the marketing claimed, the distance between no lethal dose in animals and completely safe even for pregnant women, is where the disaster was sheltered. I want to say something about the physicians in the middle of this, because they are sometimes treated in accounts of the thalidomide story as passive conduits, people through whom the drug moved from manufacturer to patient without adding anything to the transaction. This is not quite accurate. The physicians who prescribed thalidomide to pregnant women were making clinical decisions. They were applying their training and their professional judgment. The problem was that their training and their professional judgment had been formed in an environment shaped by the information available to them, and the information available to them had been substantially shaped by the manufacturer. A physician in 1959 who prescribed Contergan to a pregnant patient was not making an irrational decision. He was making the decision that the best available information supported. His medical journals had carried clinical reports supporting the drug's safety. The representative who had visited his practice had been knowledgeable and specific about the clinical data. The drug had been on the market for 2 years without widely reported problems. The regulatory authorities of his country had not raised concerns. The patient in front of him was suffering from morning sickness, which was real and uncomfortable, and he had something that demonstrably helped. The prescription was the rational clinical response to the situation as it was understood at that moment. The irrationality, if we want to locate it somewhere, belongs not to the individual physician but to the system that produced his information environment, to the testing that had not asked the right questions, to the marketing that had stated the unqualified claim, to the regulatory framework that had not required more. The physician was working within constraints he did not know were there, making decisions he had been given no reason to doubt. The morning sickness application expanded the drug's market considerably. Morning sickness affects the majority of pregnant women to some degree, and a significant proportion experience it with enough severity to seek medical help. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the women who walked into doctors' offices with this complaint were not, in the main, making particularly heavy demands on the medical system. They were women who felt unwell and who wanted relief, and who, in most cases, trusted their physicians to provide it. The prescription of thalidomide for morning sickness was, by the standards of clinical practice in that era, appropriate care. It addressed a real need with a drug that appeared to be safe. The only thing wrong with it was the one thing that no one had been asked to check. I want to take you inside a doctor's surgery now. I want to be specific about it, because the specific is where this story lives. London, 1960. A Thursday morning in October, say. The kind of grey October morning that is entirely characteristic of that city, that particular season, where the light arrives at an angle and the streets carry the smell of damp leaves and bus exhaust and the particular metallic cold of autumn beginning. Not unpleasant exactly, just very much what it is. You are sitting in the waiting room of a general practice surgery in a residential neighbourhood somewhere in the city's comfortable middle. The surgery occupies the ground floor of a terraced house, converted in the years after the war, and the waiting room carries the particular atmosphere of spaces where people who are not entirely well sit and wait. Chairs arranged along the walls, upholstered in a fabric that has been cleaned many times and is tired at the molecular level despite looking presentable. A low table near the door with magazines that are approximately 3 months out of date. Women's magazines mostly, a copy of a general interest weekly, the occasional medical supplement that has wandered in from the staff's reading, a print of something coastal on the wall chosen for being inoffensive, which it is. The smell is disinfectant and a faint trace of someone's perfume, and the particular warm neutrality of a room that has contained many people's anxieties without becoming anxious itself. You are 8 weeks pregnant. You know this not because anyone has officially told you. The appointment today is partly for that, but because your body has been telling you for 4 weeks with the focused insistence of someone who does not consider argument appropriate. The mornings have been difficult. That is the accurate word for it, the word that captures it without overstating it, because you are managing, you are getting through, but managing and getting through are the kind of phrases that contain within them the effort required to make them true. The nausea arrives before the alarm most mornings. You lie still when you first wake, in the grey half-light before the day has decided what kind of day it will be, taking a kind of internal inventory, bad or manageable. And then you move carefully to the bathroom and the sequence begins. By the time you have washed your face and come downstairs and put the kettle on, the worst of it has usually passed. Usually. The word does a lot of work in your mornings at the moment. Usually the tea goes down without incident. Usually the dry toast that your mother suggested helps. Usually by 9 or half past you feel something approaching a person who could have a normal Tuesday. But you are tired in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Not simply sleepy, not the ordinary tiredness of insufficient rest. A kind of fundamental tiredness. A tiredness that sits behind the ordinary effort of existing and makes that effort slightly more effortful than usual. You are 8 weeks pregnant and you have a kitchen to keep and a husband who comes home to supper and a mother who telephones twice a week to offer useful advice, and you are doing all of these things while your body is, without consultation, rerouting an enormous amount of its energy towards something else entirely. You are grateful for the pregnancy. Deeply, genuinely grateful, and you would not undo it. And when you think about what is growing, still theoretical at 8 weeks, still more idea than person, but real in the way that things you cannot see are real when you can feel them, the gratitude is uncomplicated. It is just that you are also very tired and would quite like the mornings to be different. The nurse calls your name. You follow her down a short corridor to the doctor's office, which smells of warm paper and polished wood and something faintly medicinal that you will later associate, whenever you encounter it, with this particular morning. The doctor is a man in his mid-50s with reading glasses and a manner that is unhurried in the way that the best general practitioners of that era were unhurried. They had large lists and full waiting rooms, and yet the good ones contrived to make the time inside the consultation feel sufficient. He confirms what you already knew. Congratulations. Yes, everything looks as it should. The sickness is very normal. Most women experience some degree of it in the first trimester, and it usually eases considerably by around 12 weeks. He takes some notes for the record. He asks about your general health, about any history of complications in your family, about your diet, about whether you are taking folic acid, and then he closes his notebook and he asks about the nausea. Is it manageable? He asks. You say that it is manageable because it is by your definition of the word, but something of the effort required to make it manageable must show in your face or in the particular care with which you have chosen the word manageable rather than fine, because he nods with the slight thoughtful adjustment of a man who is listening to what was said and what was not said simultaneously. He picks up his pen. There is something I can give you, he says. It is perfectly safe. He says this with the calm, specific confidence of someone who has said it many times before. He writes on the prescription pad in the doctor's handwriting of that era, confident, slightly illegible, the letters sloping forward as though they have somewhere to be. He tears the sheet from the pad with the practiced efficiency of a man who fills prescriptions in the hundreds per week and hands it across the desk in the way that the doctor's desk and the patient's chair naturally require across the wide formal space of professional authority. You take the prescription and put it in your bag. The consultation takes perhaps 12 minutes in total. You thank him. He wishes you well with the pregnancy, with a warmth that is genuine and brief, and the nurse is already in the corridor to show you out. You stop at the chemist's on the way home. The pharmacy is 3 streets from the surgery, the kind of small independent pharmacy that occupied high streets in every town and neighbourhood in England at that time, where the pharmacist knew his regular customers by name, and the shelves behind the counter were dense with the specific visual language of pharmaceutical packaging. Glass bottles, cardboard boxes, labels in the clean authoritative typography of the era's product design. The pharmacist is a younger man than your doctor, efficient and entirely pleasant. He takes your prescription and reads it with the speed of professional familiarity, disappears behind the counter for a moment and returns with a small bag. He hands it over with the receipt stapled to the outside. Take them as directed, he says, with the mild professional warmth of someone completing a transaction that is, in his understanding, entirely routine. He does not say anything about particular precautions, because there are no particular precautions he has been asked to mention. The drug is available without prescription in some countries. In West Germany, it has been over-the-counter since 1957's, and while in Britain a prescription is required, the act of dispensing it does not involve any special protocols. It is a safe drug. The literature is clear about this. The manufacturer has said so, explicitly and repeatedly. The physician has confirmed it. The pharmacist has no reason to add any note of caution that the physician did not see fit to add. At home, you put the small bottle in the bathroom cabinet. The bathroom cabinet is the kind of fixture of 1960s domestic life that contained the working inventory of the household's medical needs: aspirin, bicarbonate of soda, the sticking plasters in various sizes, the bottle of cough linctus that has been there since last winter and is probably still good, the various small items of the domestic pharmacopoeia that accumulated without anyone particularly deciding to accumulate them. The small bottle from today goes on the shelf beside the aspirin. You close the cabinet door. In the mirror, you look exactly as you have always looked, which is the particular quality of early pregnancy. The enormous internal change is entirely invisible from the outside. That evening you take one tablet with a glass of water before bed. You fall asleep more quickly than usual, quite a bit more quickly actually, which is welcome because the tiredness of the past few weeks has made sleep something you arrive at with relief rather than simply falling into. In the morning, the nausea is quieter, genuinely quieter, not entirely absent, but changed in character, reduced in insistence, manageable now in the uncomplicated sense of the word rather than the one that requires effort. You think, thank goodness for modern medicine. This is not a naive thought. It is a thought arrived at through the experience of a woman who has been feeling unwell and has now been given something that helps. The thought is entirely reasonable, grounded in the evidence of her own body. The doctor said it was safe. The pharmacist dispensed it without comment. The pill worked. These are the facts available to her, and they are the facts that matter in the kitchen of a house in London in 1960. Now let me stand alongside this woman for a moment because I want to say something about trust. The women who took thalidomide during their pregnancies were not naive. They were not especially credulous. They were not failing to think carefully about what they were putting into their bodies. They were making decisions, the best decisions available to them, within an information environment that was telling them through every credible channel that the drug was safe. Their physicians, whom they had chosen and trusted over time, had prescribed it or recommended it. The regulatory systems of their countries had approved it. The pharmaceutical companies had said, repeatedly and with conviction, that it was safe. The cultural message of the era was that modern medicine was a reliable and advancing good, and that the drugs it produced were to be trusted. Trust, in this story, is not the name of the error. Trust, in this context, was the entirely rational response of intelligent people to a system that had told them something that wasn't true. The error and the moral weight of this story belongs to the system and to the people who built and maintained the system and who made the specific choices, the choice not to ask certain questions, the choice not to disclose certain findings, that made the system's information false. Outside the bathroom window, the October garden is going grey with the season. The magnolia tree that was extraordinary in April is bare now, the leaves fallen, the pale branches patient against the sky. The baby is 8 weeks old in the way that something can be old before it has arrived, before it has become fully itself. The limbs are forming. The exquisite structures of the embryo's arms and legs, the condensations of cells that will become bone and muscle, and the hands that will eventually hold things, are in the process of forming right now in the dark interior of a body that believes itself to be well and cared for, and in the hands of people who know what they are doing. The bottle is on the shelf. The morning is manageable. Everything is, within the visible world of this particular morning, fine. This is what the consultation looked like in London in 1960, and in Hamburg in 1959, and in Sydney in 1961, and in dozens of other cities in dozens of other countries where pregnant women walked into doctors' offices and walked out again with the small white bottle. The specific details varied, the colour of the waiting room's carpet, the length of the appointment, the precise phrasing of the physician's reassurance, but the essential shape was the same: a woman, a doctor, a prescription, a bottle of tablets, the assertion of safety. The assertion delivered with confidence by someone who believed it. Because here is what the doctor knew in October 1960 when he wrote that prescription. He knew what the pharmaceutical representative had told him. He knew what the journal literature, funded in significant part by the manufacturer, had said. He knew that the drug had been on the market for 3 years in West Germany without obvious catastrophe. He knew that his patients who had used it reported feeling better. He had no reason to doubt the safety claim because the safety claim had been built on a foundation that, by the standards available to him, appeared solid. What he did not know was that the foundation had a dimension that no one had examined, that the testing that had produced the safety claim had never looked at what the drug did inside a pregnant body, that a body of adverse event reports, of patients experiencing nerve damage in their limbs, of something beginning to be called peripheral neuropathy, had been accumulating at the manufacturer's offices and had not been fully disclosed. That the placenta through which he assumed the baby was protected was, in fact, no protection at all against this particular compound. He did not know. He handed the prescription across the desk with the confidence of someone who believes what he has been told. And she took it home and put it in the bathroom cabinet, and took it each morning with her tea. and was grateful for it in the ordinary way of someone for whom something that was hard is now easier. Let me slow down inside the consulting room for another moment, because there is something in the exchange between physician and patient in that era that is worth understanding more fully. The doctor's appointment in 1960 was not, in most cases, a lengthy event. General practitioners in Britain and West Germany and Australia were managing large patient lists with limited administrative support, and the time available for each consultation was genuinely constrained. 15 minutes was generous. 10 minutes was common. In that time, the physician needed to hear the presenting complaint, take the relevant history, examine the patient where examination was indicated, make a clinical judgment, and communicate that judgment in terms the patient could understand. This was not different from what general practice requires today, except that today the constraints are acknowledged as constraints, and there is at least a formal expectation that the physician will discuss the risks and benefits of proposed treatments. In 1960, the culture of the consultation was different. The physician prescribed, the patient received. The dynamic was not one of shared decision-making in any meaningful sense. This matters for the thalidomide story because it means that the communication between physician and patient about what was being prescribed was, in most cases, very brief. The physician said the drug was safe. The physician handed over the prescription. The patient received both the piece of paper and the reassurance simultaneously as part of the same transaction. There was no extended conversation about what the drug had been tested for, what the nature and limitations of the safety data were, what side effects had been reported in the literature. These were not conversations that the culture of the consultation room made routine in 1960. The prescription was not an invitation to a discussion. It was a professional recommendation offered from authority to trust. The patient's side of this transaction is also worth examining. The women who received thalidomide prescriptions in those years were, for the most part, women who had been raised in a culture that respected medical authority and who had no professional training that would have enabled them to evaluate the prescription they were receiving. They did not have access to the pharmaceutical literature that Kelsey was reading in Washington. They did not know about the adverse event reports accumulating in Stolberg. They did not know about Ralph Voss's 1959 paper on peripheral neuropathy. They knew what their doctor had told them, and what their doctor had told them was that the drug was safe. The prescription pad and the small white package from the pharmacy were, for these women, the material evidence of trust given form. This is not a metaphor. They held physically in their hands a piece of paper on which a physician had written a prescription and a small box of tablets that a pharmacist had dispensed without comment. These were real objects carrying real institutional authority. The decision to take the tablets was not a careless decision. It was the most reasonable decision available, made in the information environment the system had produced. I want to note something about the pharmacy visit itself because I have mentioned it briefly and it deserves slightly more attention. The pharmacist who dispensed thalidomide in 1960 occupied a particular position in the chain of the drug's distribution. He or she, though pharmacy in that era was predominantly male, had access to professional information about the drugs being dispensed that the patient did not. The pharmacist received the same promotional materials, the same detail men, the same journal literature as the physician, and the pharmacist, like the physician, had no information that contradicted the safety claim. The adverse event reports were not in the professional information environment of the community pharmacist. The peripheral neuropathy literature was not being communicated in ways that reached him as a matter of clinical urgency. He dispensed the drug with the confidence of someone who had been given no reason not to. Outside the pharmacy, on the high street, the autumn was doing what the autumn does in English cities, coming in at an angle, turning the plane trees gold, bringing the smell of wood smoke from somewhere in the direction of the park. The woman with the small white bag walked home through it in the ordinary way of someone running an errand, unremarkable, passing other people who were running other errands, in a city that had no idea what was accumulating in the bathroom cabinets of its residential streets. There is one more thing about that consultation room that I want to say, and it concerns something that is easy to miss in retrospect, but that was the defining feature of the medical encounter in 1960. The woman who walked into the doctor's surgery that October afternoon was not a passive recipient of care. She was an intelligent adult who had thoughts about her situation, who had read the pregnancy books, who had asked questions of the friends who had had children before her. She came into the consultation with her own body of knowledge, her own concerns, her own sense of what was happening inside her and what she wanted from the medical encounter. None of this is absent from the picture. What is also true is that the knowledge she had and the knowledge her physician had were not equivalent, and the social structure of the consultation room in 1960 did not create any mechanism for her to bridge the gap. She did not know what her physician knew about the pharmacological literature. She did not know what the detail man had told him or failed to tell him. She did not know that in Hamburg, a geneticist named Lenz was beginning to accumulate a list of cases, or that in Sydney, a physician named McBride had started asking questions, or that in Stolberg, the letters about peripheral neuropathy were piling up in the company's correspondence files. She knew what she could observe and feel in her own body, and she knew what she had been told, and what she had been told was that the drug was safe. Her physician said so. The prescription said so in its implicit language of professional confidence. The culture said so in its general faith in pharmaceutical progress. The converging authority of these three sources produced a certainty that was, from inside the situation, indistinguishable from certainty that was deserved. She walked home through the October afternoon with the small white paper bag from the pharmacy, and the day folded around her ordinary and complete, and the knowledge that would have changed everything remained in the places where knowledge tends to remain when institutional interests are in the way of its movement, in the filing cabinets of a pharmaceutical company in Stolberg, and in the unanswered questions of a regulatory review in Washington, and in the observations of physicians who had not yet found the language to name what they were seeing. The particular quality of life in that kitchen, in that suburb, in that Tuesday morning in those years, deserves some time. The early 1960s were, in Britain and West Germany and Australia and the other countries where thalidomide had found its market, years of a particular kind of domestic life. The domestic life was the life that most married women of the educated middle class were expected to inhabit with some seriousness. The house was their professional sphere, in the sense that the word professional can carry without being entirely welcome. It implied standards, implied output, implied the particular pride of a job done well in a domain that the era had carefully arranged to be yours. The management of the household, the cooking, the cleaning, the maintenance of a family's daily routines, the social arrangements that kept a household connected to the world around it, was understood not merely as a necessity, but as a form of skill, even of identity. Women's magazines devoted considerable ink to the achievement of this domestic sphere. How to manage the weekly budget without visible effort. How to cook a nourishing meal for a family that would not realize how long it took. How to create a home that felt comfortable and unstressful when the husband arrived. This portrait requires some honesty. It was not entirely a portrait of repression, though it contained repression. Many women in those years found genuine satisfaction in aspects of domestic life, genuine pleasure in the rituals of keeping a house and feeding a family and watching children grow. The domestic sphere was for some women a space of real competence and real pride. This is a true thing that coexists with the other true things, that the domestic sphere was also constrained, also smaller than the capacities of most of the women inside it, and also structured in ways that left certain kinds of unhappiness without adequate name or outlet. The pregnancy for most of these women was the thing that gave the domestic life its primary significance. The child coming, the expansion of the future that a pregnancy represents, the opening out of time into something larger and more permanent than any single day, the nursery to prepare, the name to choose, the particular private attention to the body's changes, the small signs of progress that the woman alone in her daily life had access to. And so, the morning tablet, the small white tablet from the small orange bottle, was embedded in a life that was already organized entirely around care. The woman who took it was already the person responsible for keeping the household running, for managing her own health so that the pregnancy would go well, for doing the 1,000 small things that constituted her working day. Adding a tablet to this routine was, if anything, a simplification. Something that had been difficult, the mornings, was now easier. The tablet was part of managing, in the most practical and least dramatic sense. What did it feel like exactly to take thalidomide in 1960? The reports from patients who were using the drug as a nighttime sedative describe a quality of sleep that was heavier and more immediate than ordinary sleep, a dropping away, a going under that was faster than usual but from which they woke without the heavy-headedness that the barbiturates had commonly produced. The drug was fast, it was clean. You took it, and within an hour you were asleep, genuinely asleep, and in the morning you were awake without difficulty. For women taking it for morning sickness, not as a nighttime sedative, but as a morning medication. The experience was different in quality, but similar in character. The nausea simply became less. Not dramatically less, in most cases, not a miraculous cessation of all discomfort, but reduced in intensity, changed in quality, made manageable in a way that had not been manageable before. The appetite returned, or rather, the counter-appetite. The active aversion to food that serious nausea produces, retreated. The first cup of tea of the morning was possible again, without the careful sipping and the hoping. The scrambled eggs that had been unthinkable for 6 weeks were possible again, and the possibility of scrambled eggs at 8 in the morning is not a small thing to someone for whom they have been impossible. Small things become significant when they are restored. I want to build a specific morning here. Not a dramatic morning, just a Tuesday. It is November 1960. You are 11 weeks pregnant. The house you share with your husband in a suburb somewhere outside one of the English cities is the kind of house that the post-war building program and the expanding middle class of the late 1950s produced in large numbers. Semi-detached, 3 bedrooms, a garden front and back. A kitchen that was updated when you moved in and that your mother admired because it had a refrigerator with a modern handle and a gas cooker with an eye-level grill. The kitchen has curtains at the window above the sink, something floral, blue and white, that you chose from a sample book that the department store let you borrow for a week. The Formica counter that runs the length of the back wall is a pale cream color and is very easy to clean, which matters when you are the one doing the cleaning. The shelf above the cooker has the spice jars in a row, and the biscuit tin with the painted lid that was a wedding present, and a small wooden rack that holds the cookery books you use most often. It is 7:30 in the morning. Your husband left for work 20 minutes ago. You heard the front door close and then the particular sound of his car starting, 2 attempts before it caught, and then the diminishing sound of the engine going down the street. The house is quiet now, in the specific way that houses are quiet when the person who fills them most is absent, not empty, just quieter. You slept well last night. You have slept well, in fact, for the past 3 weeks since you started the tablets, and you are aware of the difference in a way that makes you grateful in a slightly new register. Grateful not for something ordinary, but for the contrast with the weeks before it, when sleep had been interrupted and uncertain and more effortful than it should be. You put the kettle on. While it heats, you collect the breakfast things, the bread that needs to come out of the bin, the butter from the refrigerator, the orange marmalade your mother made in February, and that is almost finished. You set a single plate. You get down the cup and saucer that you use in the mornings, the blue one from the set your husband's parents gave you, and you do all of this with the unhurried efficiency of someone who is doing something they have done many hundreds of times and whose body knows the sequence without needing to be told. The bathroom cabinet is upstairs, but you came down this morning with the tablet already in your hand, which has become the habit of the past 3 weeks. You take it now with the first cautious sip of tea that you pour as soon as the kettle is boiled, before it has time to get too hot. The tablet is small enough to swallow without particular difficulty. It is entirely tasteless. It goes down with the tea, and that is in all visible respects that. You make the toast, 2 slices. The smell of it is entirely tolerable, which is progress. 3 weeks ago, the smell of toast in the morning had been one of the specific difficulties. You butter it while it is still hot enough that the butter melts immediately, and sit down at the kitchen table with your tea and your toast and the sound of the radio, which you turned on while the kettle boiled because you prefer the kitchen with voices in it when the house is otherwise quiet. The nausea is quiet this morning. That is the right way to describe it. Quiet rather than absent. It is there, somewhere at the periphery of your awareness, the way that a sound in the next room is present, even when you are not particularly listening to it. But it is not at the center of things. The center of things is the toast and the tea and the morning news on the radio and the list you are composing in your head of what needs to happen today. The shopping that needs to happen because you are nearly out of good coffee and the sort your husband prefers, and the letter you promised your friend you would write, and the room upstairs that you and your husband have decided to begin clearing out this weekend. The room that has been used for storage. The room that will become something else. You are 11 weeks pregnant, and you are eating breakfast in your kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, and the day is entirely ordinary in every visible way. The tablet is doing what it promised. The nausea is quiet. The toast is adequate. The morning is fine. This is what the daily life of a woman on thalidomide looked like in 1960. Not dramatic, not notable, not anything other than ordinary. A tablet with the first cup of tea, the morning quiet and manageable, the day proceeding. Catastrophes that happen inside bodies and that only become visible months later in other rooms with other people present look like Tuesday mornings from the inside. Let me tell you, while you sit at the kitchen table with your tea, about what is happening 900 miles away. In Hamburg, in a children's hospital at the University of Hamburg, a pediatrician named Widukind Lenz has been called in the past year and a half to examine an unusual number of babies with limb malformations. Phocomelia, from the Greek for seal limb, a term that describes the appearance of shortened or absent limbs attached close to the body, is what these babies have. Arms that end at the elbow or at the shoulder, legs that did not fully form below the knee. In some of the most severely affected children, all four limbs are involved. In others, additional effects appear. The ears, the eyes, the internal structures that form during the same window of development. Lenz is a geneticist and pediatrician. He knows the historical incidence of phocomelia because he has studied the literature and because it is the kind of thing that a careful specialist in this area would know. Phocomelia, before 1958, was extraordinarily rare. It appeared occasionally in the literature as a curiosity, as an anomaly. Many obstetricians went their entire careers without encountering it. Some pediatricians never saw a case. Lenz has now seen more than he can account for. He has been checking with colleagues. He has been writing letters to other pediatricians at other hospitals in other cities, and what he is hearing from some of them is that they too have seen something unusual, something they don't quite have a framework for yet. He has begun taking histories from the mothers, methodically, carefully, in the manner of a man who understands that the pattern he is looking for may be buried inside the details that seem unremarkable. He asks about their health during pregnancy. He asks about illnesses. He asks about what they ate. He asks about what they took, any vitamins, any supplements, any medications for any reason. He is asking the right question. He does not yet have enough answers to know that he is asking the right question, but the question is there and the interviews are accumulating and the mothers are answering, and somewhere in the answers a pattern is forming that he is not yet able to see clearly. And in Sydney, Australia, a physician named William McBride is asking a version of the same question, independently, for the same reasons, having seen the same things. They do not know each other. They are working in different hemispheres, in different languages, approaching the same answer from different directions, and without knowledge of each other's approach. The woman in the kitchen in England does not know any of this. She has no reason to know it. She finishes her toast. She rinses her plate. She turns off the radio. She goes upstairs to begin the cleaning. The bottle with 7 tablets remaining is on the bathroom shelf behind the cabinet door. The morning light is coming through the frosted window glass in the pale grey way of November. She is thinking about the room they are going to clear this weekend. The cot her sister-in-law has said they can borrow. The colour of the walls. She has 2 ideas for this and is not certain which is better and finds the uncertainty pleasantly occupying. The Saturday ahead and the work it will involve and what it will mean to have it done. She is thinking with a warm and entirely private attention about the spring. Let me tell you about the domestic life of that era in a little more detail, because the domesticity is not incidental to the story. It is part of the information environment in which the drug existed. The women who were taking thalidomide for morning sickness in 1960 were living in a world that had organized itself, in many respects, around the production of female domesticity as a virtue and a project. The magazines they read, the women's magazines that arrived at the door weekly or monthly, that sat on the low table in the waiting room, that were passed between neighbors and friends, were full of household management, full of recipes and decoration advice and suggestions about how to run a household efficiently and pleasantly. Full of articles about the management of children's health, the management of a husband's comfort, the management of one's own appearance in ways that continued to signal competence and femininity simultaneously. In this world, the management of a pregnancy was part of the same domestic project. You ate well, you rested, you took the supplements your physician recommended, you prepared the nursery, you read about what was happening to the baby's development. The pregnancy books of the era were beginning to describe fetal development in accessible terms, and the women who read them knew, in general outline, that the early weeks were when the fundamental structures were forming. They knew this in the way that people know things they have read in books, as information held at the level of interest rather than the level of clinical detail. The detail that was not in the pregnancy books of 1960, the detail that would not be in them for years because it was not yet known, was the detail about drug-induced teratogenicity, about what certain compounds crossing the placenta that was assumed to be protective might do to the specific condensations of embryonic tissue that were forming right now in the first trimester. This gap in the knowledge reflected the gap in the science. The science had not yet described this mechanism in ways accessible to a general audience because the science itself had not yet fully understood it. The pregnancy books of 1960 contained what the science of 1960 had established, and the science of 1960 had not yet established this. So, the woman in the kitchen on the Tuesday morning in November took her tablet with her tea and spread her toast with the salted butter her husband preferred, and thought about the weekend ahead and the room to be cleared and the walls to be painted, and all of this was exactly as ordinary as it appears. The ordinariness is the point. The catastrophes that matter most are often the ones that look from the inside like Tuesday mornings. In the months that followed, December, January, February, the pregnancy progressing through its second trimester and toward the third, the tablets continued as a morning routine and the nausea continued to be manageable and the baby continued to develop and the appointment with the midwife was made and the list of things to do before the arrival continued to grow. The bottle on the shelf was used and refilled and used again. The morning ritual of tablet and tea became as unremarkable as any morning ritual becomes, part of the structure of the day, noticed only in the way that things noticed become eventually invisible. By the time the second trimester arrived and the morning sickness eased on its own, as it typically does, the tablets were no longer necessary. The bottle, by then, probably had some tablets remaining. The remaining tablets went into the bathroom cabinet where they sat alongside the aspirin and the vitamin supplements, a small and ordinary archive of remedies that had been needed and were needed no longer. In the way of medicine cabinets, they would sit there for a while before being forgotten about, and then at some point the bottle would be cleared away, perhaps when the cabinet was reorganized for the arrival of the baby, whose own small pharmacy of needs would require its own shelf space. The baby arrived in spring 1961. The season the woman had been thinking about in November while she stood in the kitchen with her tea had arrived, and what arrived with it is the part of this story that we cannot make ordinary, no matter how ordinary everything that preceded it was. Let me tell you about the world of thalidomide at the height of its success, because it is worth understanding what kind of thing this was before we come to what it became. By 1960, Contergan was one of the most commercially successful drugs in West Germany. It was not merely a successful drug in the way that many drugs are successful, selling steadily, finding its market, performing as projected. It was a phenomenon in the specific sense that some pharmaceutical products achieve in certain eras. The drug that becomes part of the domestic landscape, the thing that sits in the medicine cabinet the way that aspirin or bicarbonate of soda sits in the medicine cabinet, the thing whose presence is assumed. West Germans were buying it in enormous quantities. The over-the-counter market, which had no prescription barrier, no gatekeeping mechanism, just the product on the shelf and the willingness to purchase it, was substantial. The prescription market, driven by the sales force and the cooperative physician network, was additionally substantial. The figures were not merely good, they were excellent. Across more than 40 countries, the international licensing network was generating its own revenues. The distiller's operation in the United Kingdom, which had launched Distaval in 1958, was performing well. The drug's penetration into the British market had been swift, partly because the British system, which did require a prescription, meant that the Grünenthal representatives and their distillers' counterparts had been working the physician network actively and effectively. The journals had carried advertisements, the representatives had made their rounds, the physicians had written the prescriptions, the chemists had dispensed them. Australia was receiving the drug through the distiller's licensing arrangement and was similarly active. Canada's Frank W. Horner was selling it. Brazil had it under the name Sedative. Japan was on the verge of its own launch, which would occur in 1958 under the name Izamin and which would in due course produce its own separate tragedy. Across continental Europe, the brand names varied while the compound remained the same. Sofenen in Spain, Polygrippin in Portugal. In every market, the same essential marketing, the same essential claim. Let me tell you something about pharmaceutical advertising in that era, specifically the advertising directed at physicians rather than the general public. It appeared primarily in medical journals, the professional publications that physicians read to stay current, to understand new developments, to see what the industry was producing that might be relevant to their patients. In these journals, the advertisements for Contergan and Distaval and Kevadon and all the other brand iterations occupied pages alongside peer-reviewed clinical research, and this adjacency was not accidental. The implication was of equivalence. Here is the research, and here is the product, and they speak with the same kind of authority. The advertisements were well designed, in the polished mid-century manner of pharmaceutical marketing. Clean typography, authoritative layout, photographs or illustrations that suggested peace and comfort and rest. A sleeping woman, a calm domestic interior, the imagery of rest achieved, worry dissolved, the particular relief of a good night's sleep after nights of poor ones. And in the language of the advertisements, the word safe appeared again and again in various formations, with the consistency of a message that its authors had decided was their most important claim and intended to make without equivocation. The physicians who received these advertisements in their journals, and who received visits from the representatives, and who attended the evening symposia and educational dinners that pharmaceutical companies organized for physicians in that era, these physicians were intelligent and well-trained and in the main genuinely committed to their patients' welfare. They were also human beings operating within the information environment available to them, which was an information environment that had been substantially shaped by the manufacturer. This is worth stating without melodrama. It is not that the physicians were credulous or that they failed to apply their training. It is that the training they had received had not prepared them to interrogate pharmaceutical marketing in the way that we would now consider appropriate, partly because the concept that pharmaceutical marketing required that kind of interrogation was less well developed in 1959 than it later became. The idea that a manufacturer might not fully disclose the adverse event profile of its product, that the regulatory reporting requirements of the era were insufficient to compel full disclosure, was not a prominent feature of the physician's conceptual landscape. Drugs were tested, they were approved, they were marketed, the system was assumed to work. Now let me tell you what Grünenthal knew, and when it knew it, because this is where the story of the company becomes something more than the story of good faith error. By 1959, 2 years after Contergan's launch, before it had found its application as a morning sickness drug in the largest possible numbers, adverse event reports were beginning to arrive at Grünenthal's medical department. They were not arriving in large numbers. They were not arriving with the obvious urgency of a drug that was killing people rapidly. They were arriving with the quiet, particular quality of reports about something that was wrong in a way that was uncomfortable but not immediately dramatic. Patients who had been taking Contergan long-term, taking it regularly for sleep over weeks and months, were reporting tingling in their hands and feet, numbness, a strange crawling sensation in the limbs. What a physician examining such a patient would recognize as signs of peripheral neuropathy, damage to the nerves of the peripheral nervous system, the network of nerves that extends from the spinal cord into the limbs and carries sensory and motor signals to and from the extremities. A physician named Ralph Voss published observations about this side effect in a German medical journal in 1959. This was real, peer-reviewed, published, accessible medical literature. It was not hidden. It appeared in a journal that Grünenthal's medical department read. It appeared in a journal that other physicians in West Germany and, in principle, beyond read. It described clearly and professionally the peripheral neuropathy that some patients on long-term thalidomide were experiencing, and it raised the question of whether the drug was responsible. Grünenthal received this publication and the adverse event reports that accompanied and followed it. What happened inside the company in response to these reports is documented imperfectly, partially, in the way that internal corporate documents are always imperfectly documented in the correspondence that was later subpoenaed and examined during legal proceedings. And what the documents show is a pattern that is familiar from subsequent pharmaceutical controversies, and that is perhaps more disturbing for being familiar. The concerns were noted, there were internal discussions about them, the potential implications were acknowledged at least partially by some of those involved. There was also, running alongside this acknowledgement, a sustained attention to the commercial implications of taking action. The drug was selling exceptionally well. A revision of the labeling to include a warning about peripheral neuropathy would be commercially damaging. A voluntary withdrawal of the product for further study would be commercially devastating. The conversations about the adverse events took place in a context in which the financial performance of the product was simultaneously the most visible fact on the table. This is how institutional self-interest usually works. It does not require explicit decisions to conceal. It requires only the standard operations of institutional psychology, the minimization of uncomfortable findings, the elevation of doubt about the reliability of the concerning reports, the sustained orientation toward the outcome that the institution prefers. The question was never framed inside Grünenthal as, should we conceal these findings? It was framed as, how confident are we in these reports, and what is the appropriate response to reports of this level of confidence? And the answer, produced within an organization that had very strong reasons to prefer one kind of answer, was not confident enough to act on immediately. The Voss paper and the adverse event reports did eventually produce some response. Grünenthal communicated with physicians about the peripheral neuropathy risk. They were, however, very careful about the framing of this communication, and they were very slow in the communication's arrival. The warning was not prominent. It was not the kind of communication that would give a physician confidence that the drug's safety profile had been revised. It was the kind of communication that allowed Grünenthal to say later that it had communicated about the risk without that communication having done the work of communication in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, the sales force was not revising its pitch. The representatives were still visiting surgeries with the same materials. The advertisements in the medical journals were still running with the same language. The morning sickness application was still being promoted in the same terms. The system that was designed to generate sales continued to generate them because the changes to the information environment had been precisely calibrated to have the minimum possible effect on the commercial environment. This pattern, companies knowing about side effects of their products and managing the information about those side effects in ways that prioritized the commercial outcome over the clinical one, was not unique to Grünenthal in the history of pharmaceutical development. It is a pattern that has appeared, with variations, in other pharmaceutical disasters of the 20th and 21st centuries. The particular configurations change, the drugs change, the side effects change, but the basic dynamic of a company that knows something it does not want to know and manages that knowledge through the institutional mechanisms of minimization and delay is recognizable across the history. What it produced, in the specific case of Contergan, was an additional 18 months or 2 years of sales after the first serious concerns had been documented internally. 18 months during which pregnant women were taking the drug for morning sickness, during which the morning nausea quieted and the relief was real and the gratitude was real and the tablet on the bathroom shelf was doing exactly what it appeared to be doing. The peripheral neuropathy reports were concerning. They were, however, not the worst thing that the evidence was beginning to suggest, because the peripheral neuropathy was a side effect of long-term adult use. It was the adverse event that was visible. It was the adverse event that appeared in Voss's paper and in the internal reports and in the correspondence that Grünenthal's medical department was managing. The other thing, the thing in the delivery rooms, the thing that would become the central fact of the thalidomide story, was not yet clearly visible. It was forming. In the neonatal wards of West German hospitals, pediatricians were beginning to see things they had not seen before. In the maternity records of certain institutions, unusual entries were beginning to accumulate. The pattern was there, in the data, if anyone stood back far enough to see it. The data had not yet found a person who stood at exactly the right distance. The sales continued, the advertisements ran, the detail men made their rounds, the women took their morning tablets, and in the offices of Chemie Grünenthal in Stolberg, the quarterly figures were logged and the licensing revenues arrived from more than 40 countries, and the world continued to believe that the drug on the shelf had been adequately examined. There is something quietly important to note here about the pharmaceutical regulatory landscape of 1960 because it shaped what happened and why. In most of the countries where thalidomide was being sold, the regulatory requirements for drug approval were considerably less stringent than what would later become standard. The requirement that a drug be proved safe was generally present. The requirement that it be proved effective was, in many jurisdictions, not. The requirement that the manufacturer report adverse events in a systematic and complete way was not well developed. The requirement that pre-market testing include evaluation of what a drug might do to a developing fetus did not exist as a standard requirement. These were gaps, structural gaps, in the system that was supposed to be protecting people. The United States had a requirement for FDA approval before a drug could be sold, and the FDA approval process was more demanding than most of its international equivalents. But even the FDA did not yet require teratogenicity testing as a standard part of a new drug application. The framework for asking the question that needed to be asked had not yet been built anywhere. What was being built in the accumulating adverse event reports and in the quiet observations of pediatricians and in the bedroom mornings of women across the developed world was the evidence that would eventually force the framework to be built. The evidence had a specific shape. It was arriving in pieces from many directions. What it needed to become visible as evidence rather than as the noise of individual anomalies was someone who knew how to look at it. That someone was, in late 1961, beginning to find what he was looking for. Let me tell you more about what was inside Grünenthal's correspondence during the years of Contergan's commercial success, because it is one of those documentary records that illuminates the distance between what an institution knows and what it says. The adverse event reports that were arriving at Grünenthal's medical department from 1959 onward were not, individually, alarming in the obvious sense. Peripheral neuropathy, tingling and numbness in the extremities, is an uncomfortable symptom, but not an immediately life-threatening one. Patients experiencing it were not dying. They were not requiring hospitalization. They were noting, in the way that patients note things to their physicians, that something was happening in their hands and feet that had not been happening before. The physicians, noting what the patients had noted, were reporting it to the manufacturer. What Grünenthal did with these reports is a question that the subsequent legal proceedings explored, and the documents that emerged from those proceedings tell a story that is familiar enough to pharmaceutical historians, but that still carries a particular quality of unease. There was internal discussion of the neuropathy reports. There were letters between the company's medical staff that acknowledged the accumulating adverse event data. There are documents that suggest an awareness within the company that the safety profile of Contergan was more complicated than the marketing materials suggested. There are also documents that show the commercial concerns running alongside these medical ones. Revenue projections, sales figures, the licensing fees arriving from the international network. The language of these commercial documents is the ordinary language of business. Targets, performance, market share. The language of the medical documents is the ordinary language of clinical concern, adverse events, tolerance, side effects. The two sets of language exist in the same institutional filing systems, produced by the same institution at the same time. They did not apparently speak to each other with sufficient authority to produce the outcome that the medical language required. A prompt and complete revision of the safety claims, a clear communication to prescribing physicians, a voluntary withdrawal for further study. The communication that Grünenthal eventually sent to physicians about the peripheral neuropathy risk was characterized in the subsequent legal proceedings as inadequate. The company sent letters. The letters used language that acknowledged the neuropathy reports without conveying their clinical significance in terms that would have changed prescribing behavior. The framing was one of caution rather than urgency, of awareness rather than warning. A physician reading the communication might have noted it and continued prescribing, because the communication did not clearly say, "This drug may cause nerve damage and you should reconsider its long-term prescription." There is a particular craft to this kind of institutional communication. It is the craft of saying something while communicating as little as possible, of satisfying the formal requirement to disclose while calibrating the disclosure to have the minimum possible effect on the thing that the disclosure, if fully effective, would interrupt. This craft exists in pharmaceutical companies and in other institutions that face similar pressures. The pressure to be technically honest while preserving the commercial structure that full honesty would damage. It is a kind of dishonesty that is almost more troubling than outright lying because it is so much harder to prosecute and so much easier to rationalize. Meanwhile, in more than 40 countries, the bottles were on the shelves and the prescriptions were being written and the detail men were making their rounds. The detail men had not been told about the peripheral neuropathy reports in terms that would have changed their presentations. Their pitch remained what it had always been: safety, efficacy, the confidence of a product that the manufacturer stood behind completely. The gap between what the company knew and what the representatives were saying was not, in most cases, the result of deliberate deception by the representatives themselves. They said what they had been told. They had not been told everything. Let me tell you about how evidence works in medicine, because it is relevant here, and it is one of those things that once you understand it, changes the shape of many stories. Evidence in medicine does not arrive as a revelation. It does not descend from a higher plane of understanding, fully formed, with its implications clearly labeled. It accumulates. It accumulates in patient files, in the informal conversations between colleagues, in the pattern recognition that is one of the most important and least dramatic things that happens in clinical practice. A physician sees something unusual. She notes it. She mentions it to a colleague at the next meeting. The colleague may or may not have seen something similar. The pattern may or may not begin to form. Often, it takes time, weeks, months, sometimes years. Often, the same pattern is forming in multiple places simultaneously, in people who have no means of rapid communication, each working with partial information in busy clinical lives that have no obvious mechanism for bringing the partial information together. The evidence that thalidomide was causing serious harm did not arrive as a revelation. It accumulated. Slowly, unevenly, in pieces too small to see clearly, until there were enough of them and someone stood at exactly the right distance. The first unusual thing was something most of the physicians who noticed it could not immediately name, because the condition was rare enough that naming it had not been necessary in their clinical experience. Phocomelia. The word comes from the Greek words for seal and limb. Phok, which means seal, and melos, which means limb. And it describes the appearance of a limb that has not fully developed, that appears shortened or absent, with the hand or foot attached directly or nearly directly to the body in a way that recalls the flipper of a seal. The term had existed in the medical literature as a curiosity, as a description of a condition that was genuinely rare in the general population. Before 1958, many obstetricians practiced their entire careers without seeing a single case. Pediatricians might encounter one in a decade of practice. The condition appeared occasionally in the textbooks and then was not encountered because it was genuinely rare in the way that some things are genuinely rare. And then it was not rare. The change in the frequency of phocomelia and related limb reduction defects in West Germany between 1959 and 1961 was, in retrospect, extraordinary. The rate increased by somewhere between 40 and 50 times its historical baseline. 40 to 50 times. Not a small fluctuation, not the kind of increase that might be explained by improved diagnosis or changed reporting practices. A genuine, enormous, unprecedented increase in the number of children being born with severe limb malformations. The increase was there in the data. The question was whether anyone had assembled enough of the data to see the increase as an increase, rather than as a series of individual, unusual cases spread across different institutions in different cities. The physicians who first encountered affected babies described the experience with a particular kind of professional disquiet. The disquiet not of something alarming in the usual clinical sense, because the babies were alive, they were breathing, their faces were in most cases perfectly normal, they were clearly babies in every way except the way that was different. The disquiet was the disquiet of the unexpected, of seeing once something you have never seen, and making a note, and then seeing it again, which is different from seeing it once, and then hearing that someone at another institution has also seen it, which is different again, the pattern growing one step at a time toward the moment when someone says clearly, this is not random. In the summer of 1961, Dr. Wedekind Lenz had been working on exactly this problem with the kind of methodical attention that the problem required. Lenz was a geneticist and pediatrician at the Children's Hospital at the University of Hamburg, and he had the specific advantage of both a clinical role and a research orientation. He was not merely seeing patients, he was also asking questions about patterns. He had seen more cases of phocomelia than his knowledge of the historical baseline allowed him to attribute to chance. He had been corresponding with colleagues, he had been collecting information. And by the autumn of 1961, he had begun doing something very specific. He was interviewing the mothers of affected children, systematically taking detailed histories of their pregnancies. He asked about everything: what they ate, where they lived, whether they had been ill, whether they had been exposed to anything unusual. He asked, with the thoroughness of someone who knows that the answer may be buried in a detail that seems unremarkable, about what medications they had taken during the pregnancy, about what they had been prescribed, about what was in the bathroom cabinet. The histories were not all identical. Pregnancy histories rarely are. Different women had different experiences of different pregnancies, and the noise of ordinary variation meant that no single factor jumped out immediately from any one interview. But as the interviews accumulated, a factor began to appear with a frequency that was not consistent with coincidence. The word that appeared again and again in the medication histories of women who had had affected pregnancies was the word thalidomide, Contergan, the small white tablet for morning sickness, the drug on the shelf. Lentz worked carefully. He was aware, he was very specifically aware, with the awareness of someone who understands the implications of what he is looking at, that the hypothesis forming in his data was extraordinary. It was an accusation against a widely used and widely trusted pharmaceutical product. It was a claim that would, if correct, have enormous consequences. He was careful to treat it as a hypothesis for which the evidence was accumulating, but not yet proven to the standard that the hypothesis required. He cross-referenced, he checked his numbers. He compared his cases with the historical baseline. He corresponded with colleagues in other cities to determine whether they were seeing similar patterns. And by October 1961, he was not certain. In science, certainty of this kind is rarely available in advance, but he was sufficiently confident that what he was seeing was real and was serious that he believed he could no longer remain silent. But before he spoke publicly, he did something that was, as it turns out, professionally courteous, but also, in retrospect, one of the more significant moments in the story. He contacted Chemie Grünenthal. He told them what he had found, privately, in advance, as a professional courtesy, and also as an opportunity for the company to respond before his findings became public. He was not asking for their permission to share his hypothesis. He was giving them notice. He was telling them, I believe your drug is causing this. Chemie Grünenthal received this communication. They did not immediately withdraw Contergan. On November 16, 1961, Lenz presented his preliminary findings at a meeting of the German Society of Pediatrics in Düsseldorf. The presentation described the cluster of cases, the medication histories, the hypothesis that thalidomide was responsible for the increase in phocomelia and related defects. The response was, as responses to extraordinary hypotheses at medical meetings often are, mixed. Some physicians in the audience recognized what Lenz was describing and nodded in agreement. Others were cautious, as scientific audiences are appropriately cautious about claims of this magnitude without the full statistical weight of controlled evidence. The hypothesis was presented, it was not yet confirmed. Grünenthal, having received Lenz's private communication and now hearing his public presentation, waited. They waited for 2 more weeks. The company that had been told by a pediatric geneticist that its drug appeared to be causing severe birth defects in children whose mothers had taken it in early pregnancy waited for 2 weeks before taking action. During those 2 weeks, prescriptions for Contergan continued to be written. The over-the-counter tablets continued to be dispensed. Women who were in their first trimesters of pregnancy in the morning sickness window continued to take the morning tablet. On November 26, 1961, 10 days after Lenz's public presentation, 2 weeks after his private communication, Chemie Grünenthal voluntarily withdrew Contergan from the West German market. 2 weeks is not a long time in most contexts. In this context, it is the length of time during which people in positions of authority knew, at a serious level of professional credibility, that a drug was causing birth defects, and continued to allow that drug to be sold. The withdrawal was voluntary, which is the word the regulatory record uses. Grünenthal made the announcement. The drug came off the shelves. The advertising stopped. The detail men stopped visiting surgeries with samples. The loop of pharmaceutical promotion that had been running for 4 years was interrupted by the company that had been running it under the weight of evidence that had become impossible to continue ignoring. Now let me tell you about the other hemisphere, because what was happening in Hamburg was happening independently and simultaneously in Sydney. William McBride was a physician working in a maternity hospital in Sydney, Australia. He was an obstetrician with a clinical focus on normal and complicated pregnancies, and in the months leading up to the European withdrawal, he had been experiencing the same slow accumulation of unexplained observations that Lenz had been experiencing in Hamburg, though he did not know this, and Lenz did not know about him. McBride had delivered babies with limb malformations, and he had found them troubling in the specific way that an unexpected clinical finding is troubling. Not because a single case is necessarily significant, but because a second case, and a third, in a setting where such cases had not previously appeared, is the kind of thing that does not leave a careful physician's attention. He had been asking the same questions that Lenz was asking. He had been taking the same kind of medication histories. And he had been looking at the same factor appearing in those histories. In December 1961, day after the West German withdrawal, but before news of it had fully penetrated the medical world of Australia, McBride published a letter in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. The letter was brief, measured, written in the composed clinical language of someone who is raising a serious concern without claiming more than the evidence supports. It described the cases he had seen. It described the medication histories of the affected mothers. It raised, in the careful language of medical correspondence, the question of whether thalidomide might be the responsible agent. McBride and Lenz had arrived, working independently in different hemispheres in different languages at the same place. The convergence is one of those details in medical history that carries a specific weight. Evidence, when it is real, tends to present itself to people who are looking for it carefully enough. Two men, 10,000 miles apart, were both looking carefully enough. In Australia, the regulatory response to the emerging evidence was relatively swift. The Australian government moved to withdraw the drug when the implications of the German and then the Lancet reports became clear. In the United Kingdom, Distaval remained available until December 2, 1961, 6 days after the German withdrawal, 6 days during which British pharmacies continued to dispense a drug that the manufacturer of the original compound had already removed from the market in the country where it had been made. In Canada, the process of withdrawal was initiated. In Japan, where the drug had been licensed and had been on the market for several years, the withdrawal was delayed further and the ultimate toll was significant. In Brazil, the story took a different and ultimately darker path that we will come to. In most countries, the drug came off the shelves in late 1961 and early 1962. The international network of licensing agreements that had so efficiently distributed the drug to more than 40 countries now became the network through which the withdrawal was communicated. Less efficiently, because withdrawals require the will of the companies involved in each market, and companies that have been selling something successfully are not organizations naturally disposed toward decisive action. The information that the drug was being withdrawn moved through the medical world in the particular way that information moved in 1961, through journal correspondence and telephone calls and the professional networks of physicians who knew each other and who communicated in the unhurried way of an era before rapid electronic communication. It moved with gaps. It moved unevenly. Some physicians heard about the withdrawal quickly and stopped prescribing and warned their current patients. Others heard later. And in the gap, some prescriptions were still being written and some tablets were still being dispensed and some first trimester women were still taking them in the ordinary morning way. The window of thalidomide's action was narrow, as we have established. The most critical period, the 20 days of organogenesis during which limb formation was most vulnerable, was brief enough that even a few days' delay in a withdrawal could make a difference at the individual level. The aggregate of those individual differences in a drug that had been taken by millions of women across dozens of countries is not easily calculated. What can be said is this: by the time the withdrawals were complete across the major markets where thalidomide had been sold, approximately 10,000 children around the world had been born with thalidomide-related birth defects. In West Germany, where the drug had been available the longest and in the largest quantities, the number was between 5,000 and 7,000. In the United Kingdom, approximately 400 confirmed cases. In other countries, numbers ranging from tens to hundreds depending on the extent and duration of the drug's use. These were not numbers yet in late 1961. They were babies. They were women coming home from hospitals with children who were not what they had expected. They were the first hours of a set of lives that had been shaped in those 20-odd days of the first trimester by a decision made by a pharmaceutical company in a converted soap factory in a small German city. They were also, in the most important sense, the beginning of something else. The beginning of the series of consequences that would eventually reshape how the world thought about pharmaceutical safety, regulatory oversight, and the particular vulnerability of the developing human body. But all of that was still ahead. In late 1961, there was only the withdrawal and the realization that something very large had happened, and the first quiet questions about what would happen next. I want to stay inside what Widukind Lenz was doing in the autumn of 1961 for a moment longer, because the process by which he arrived at his conclusion is one of those examples of careful epidemiological thinking that deserves more than a mention. Lenz was not, initially, a specialist in birth defects. He was a human geneticist at the University of Hamburg, a researcher whose professional focus was on the inherited basis of human variation and disease. What brought him into contact with the cluster of Phocomelia cases that would eventually lead him to thalidomide was not any particular surveillance program designed to catch this kind of signal. It was the accidental fact of a pediatrician named H.R. Wiedemann at a nearby hospital who had begun to notice the increase in unusual limb reduction defects and had mentioned it to colleagues. The medical community of Hamburg in 1960 was not a large world. People knew each other. Things mentioned in professional conversation reached people who were positioned to do something with them. What Lenz did when he heard about the cases was begin to collect them systematically. He assembled a list of affected children born in the Hamburg region. He went back to their birth records. He identified their mothers. And then, and this is the step that distinguishes the investigation that mattered from the investigations that didn't, he interviewed those mothers himself in person, asking carefully about what they had taken during their pregnancies. Not just what medications they had been prescribed, but what they had actually taken, when, and for how long. The medication history that patients give, when asked carefully and specifically, is substantially more complete than the medication history that appears in a physician's notes. People remember things when asked the right questions. The interviews accumulated through the autumn of 1961. The pattern in the maternal medication histories was not immediately obvious. These things are rarely immediately obvious, but it emerged with increasing clarity as the number of cases grew. Among the mothers of affected children, there was a drug appearing with a frequency that could not be accounted for by chance: Contergan. The same drug, taken in the early weeks of pregnancy, appearing in the histories of mothers whose children had been born with the limb reduction defects that were otherwise almost unknown. Lenz did not have certainty. He had, by the time he contacted Grünenthal in late October 1961, a statistical pattern that was, in his professional assessment, too consistent and too striking to be a coincidence, but that was not yet the controlled epidemiological study that would constitute formal scientific proof. He knew that what he had was suggestive rather than definitive. He also knew that if he was right, every day he waited to make the information public was a day in which more prescriptions were being written and more tablets were being dispensed and more embryos were being exposed during the weeks when exposure mattered most. This is the specific ethical tension that his position created, the tension between the scientific standard that requires proof before a public claim and the public health imperative that requires action before proof when the potential harm is severe enough. Lenz resolved this tension by doing both things simultaneously. He told Grünenthal privately, because they were the manufacturer and they had the capacity to act immediately, and he prepared the public presentation that he gave in Düsseldorf on November 16, 1961. The Düsseldorf presentation was not a gentle offering of preliminary findings. It was a clear, documented, professionally presented case that thalidomide was causing the birth defects that the Hamburg region and, as was becoming clear, much of West Germany had been experiencing. Other physicians in the room had cases of their own. The discussion that followed the presentation was not the discussion of people who were skeptical that a pattern existed. It was the discussion of people who had been separately observing what now had a name and a cause and a direction for action. Grünenthal received all of this and waited 2 weeks. This is worth sitting with. 2 weeks between the Düsseldorf presentation, a public, professional, well-documented presentation to a medical audience that included other clinicians with corroborating cases, and the withdrawal of the drug on November 26, 1961. In those 2 weeks, Contergan continued to be dispensed by pharmacies across West Germany. Women who were in their first trimesters in the 3rd week of November continued to take their morning tablets. The critical window of organogenesis does not pause for corporate decision-making timelines. When the withdrawal came, it came without a public announcement in the terms the medical community needed. Physicians were not immediately informed in ways that allowed them to identify their patients who were currently using the drug and advise them to stop. The information moved through the system in the way that information moves through systems that are managing a crisis with one eye on liability, carefully, with attention to what was said and how it was documented in ways that prioritized institutional interests over the speed that the public health situation required. The 6 days between the German withdrawal on November 26, 1961, and the British withdrawal on December 2, 1961, are worth noting as a measure of the speed of international medical communication in that era. 6 days is, by the standards of 2026, a very long time for information of this importance to travel between 2 neighbouring European countries. By the standards of 1961, 6 days was fast. Information moved through journals and professional correspondence and telephone calls between specialists who knew each other and formal regulatory communications between national bodies. There was no mechanism for the instant global alert that the situation warranted. The mechanism had to be improvised from existing channels, and improvised channels work at the speed of their slowest component. The practical consequence of this delay, of the 6 days and of the longer delays in other countries that did not follow Germany and Britain within the same week, was that women who were in their first trimesters in the final days of November and the first days of December in 1961 continued to take thalidomide because no one had yet told them to stop. The withdrawal of the drug from sale did not immediately clear it from bathroom cabinets or from the morning routines of women who had a bottle that still had tablets remaining and no information that the tablets were a problem. The half-life of the bottle on the shelf was longer than the half-life of the news that the bottle should no longer be there. Australia, where William McBride was working, did not withdraw the drug under its brand name Distaval until May 1962, 6 months after the German withdrawal. The reasons for this delay include the time required for the Australian Regulatory Authority to evaluate the evidence and make a formal decision, and the time required for information to travel through channels that were effective but slow. 6 months is a very long time in the critical window of organogenesis. There is a thread I've been holding in reserve, and now is the moment to follow it back to its source. While all of this was happening, while the bottles were being dispensed in West Germany and Britain and Australia and 4 dozen other countries, while Lentz was interviewing mothers and McBride was composing his Lancet letter and the first babies with affected limbs were arriving in delivery rooms, there was a woman sitting at a desk in Washington, D.C., who was, in the specific and entirely procedural way of her job, refusing to approve the drug for sale in the United States. Her name was Frances Oldham Kelsey. Kelsey was born in 1914 on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. This biographical detail tends to be omitted from American tellings of her story, which prefer to frame her as an American regulatory hero, but it is worth including because her path from a Canadian island to a specific desk in a specific government agency at a specific moment is one of those unlikely trajectories that occasionally produce exactly the right person in exactly the right place. She studied science as an undergraduate and then wrote to the University of Chicago to apply for a graduate position in pharmacology. The professor she wrote to, a man named Eugene Geiling who ran the pharmacology laboratory, wrote back to accept her. He addressed his letter to Mr. F.M. Kelsey because it had not occurred to him that a woman would be applying for such a position, and the initial F had not provided the disambiguation he needed. Frances Kelsey accepted the position without correcting the assumption because correcting the assumption in 1936 would have risked the position she had applied for. She went to Chicago. She became a pharmacologist. She completed her medical degree. She published research. She married Fremont Kelsey, another pharmacologist, and they worked in overlapping areas for the rest of their careers. One of her early research projects, conducted during her time in Geiling's laboratory, is the detail that becomes most significant in retrospect. She was part of a team studying how certain drugs behave differently when administered to pregnant animals versus adult animals. Specifically, and this is the finding that lodged in her memory and in her professional framework, they found that certain drugs crossed the placental barrier in fetal animals in ways that differed meaningfully from how those drugs behaved in the adults of the same species. The placenta, in other words, was not the complete filter it was commonly assumed to be, and the developing organism on the other side of that filter might respond to a compound in ways that the adult organism would not. This finding was documented. It was published. It entered the scientific literature where it could, in principle, be found by anyone who went looking for it. In practice, in the world of pharmaceutical development and regulatory review of the late 1950s, it was not the kind of research that was routinely incorporated into the assessment of new drugs. It was exactly the kind of research, however, that a pharmacologist with Kelsey's specific training and background would have in her professional memory when she sat down to read a new drug application. She joined the United States Food and Drug Administration in August 1960. She was, at that point, the 37th employee of the agency. The FDA of 1960 was not the vast institution it would later become. It was a relatively small organization trying to manage an enormous and rapidly growing pharmaceutical market with limited resources and a mandate that was, by later standards, narrow. She was hired as a physician reviewer. Her job was to read new drug applications and determine whether they met the standards required for approval. She was given her first assignment within weeks of starting. The assignment was the new drug application filed by Richardson Merrill, a Cincinnati pharmaceutical company that held the American license for the drug they proposed to market under the brand name Kevadon. The compound was thalidomide. Kelsey read the application. She found it unsatisfactory. Her specific concern, at this early stage, was not the question of birth defects. That question was not yet being asked in the published literature, and it was not a question that the Richardson Merrill application raised. Her concern was more immediately apparent in the existing evidence. The European medical literature, accessible to Kelsey as it was accessible to anyone who looked for it, contained reports of peripheral neuropathy in patients who had taken thalidomide long-term. Voss's 1959 paper was there. Subsequent reports were appearing. These reports described something real: nerve damage in patients using the drug over an extended period. Richardson Merrill's application, in Kelsey's assessment, did not adequately address these reports. It did not adequately acknowledge their implications. The safety data presented in the application had not, in her view, been thorough enough in examining what the drug was doing to the nervous systems of patients who used it. And here is where Kelsey's earlier research becomes directly relevant. A drug that damaged peripheral nerves in adult patients raised, for her, an immediate question about what that drug might do in the context of a developing nervous system, the nervous system of an embryo, the nervous system that was forming from the condensations of early cellular structures in the first trimester of pregnancy. She did not send the application back with a definitive refusal. She sent it back with questions. She asked Richardson Merrill for additional safety data addressing the neuropathy reports. She asked for clarification on specific aspects of the application. She requested more information. Richardson Merrill was displeased. This was a perspective the company found entirely reasonable. The drug was already on the market in more than 40 countries. The safety profile had been established, in the company's view, by years of clinical use across the developed world. The FDA approval that they were seeking was, from the company's perspective, a bureaucratic requirement before selling what was already a commercially successful product in the one major market that required it. The pressure they applied to Kelsey and to her supervisors was professional and persistent. Representatives from the company contacted her. They visited the FDA. They sent materials. They characterized her objections as the work of an overly cautious and insufficiently experienced reviewer. They suggested, in various ways that remained within professional bounds, that her continued reluctance to approve the application was an obstacle without basis. They resubmitted the application, addressing Kelsey's questions in ways that she found each time inadequate to what she was asking. There is a particular quality to this kind of institutional courage that is worth acknowledging. It is not the dramatic courage of a single decisive moment. It is the courage of repeated, ordinary refusal, of saying, "Again, on a Tuesday morning in an office that the application is not sufficient, of sending it back again with the same kind of questions, of maintaining a position that the person in the position has concluded is correct under sustained pressure from people who very much want her to conclude differently, while knowing that she is relatively new to her role and that her supervisors are also receiving the pressure that she is receiving. Kelsey maintained her position. Richardson Merrill resubmitted. Kelsey found the resubmission inadequate. The back and forth continued through 1960 and into 1961, a period during which thalidomide was being sold in enormous quantities across the rest of the developed world, and during which the European medical literature that Kelsey was reading carefully was beginning to contain additional reports about the drug's side effects, reports that she was tracking, even as their full significance was not yet apparent. Meanwhile, there was something else happening in America that is essential to the thalidomide story, and that is sometimes omitted from accounts that focus only on the Kelsey narrative. Richardson Merrill had not waited for FDA approval before distributing thalidomide in the United States. Under the provisions of the era's drug law, which allowed pharmaceutical companies to distribute unapproved drugs to physicians for the purposes of clinical investigation, Richardson Merrill had provided samples of Kevidin to approximately 1,267 doctors across the United States. The total quantity distributed was approximately 2.5 million tablets. The physicians who received these samples were told they were participating in a clinical investigation. This was, in some respects, accurate. The company was gathering observational data from American physicians. It was also, in other respects, a description that covered a very wide range of arrangements. Some physicians ran genuine clinical protocols. Others simply prescribed the drug to their patients without necessarily explaining that they were part of a clinical trial. Some patients who received the drug were not informed of its investigational status. Among the patients who received Kevidin in this way were pregnant women, women who were in their first trimesters, women in the critical window of organogenesis. The number of children born in the United States with thalidomide-related birth defects, the number that Kelsey's refusal had reduced to the smallest possible figure consistent with the samples that had already been distributed, was approximately 17. 17 confirmed cases, in a country where millions of women might have received the drug had it been approved. The number 17 does not capture the lives it represents, but against the backdrop of 10,000 children affected worldwide, 17 is the measure of what happened when one person in a specific regulatory role read an application carefully and sent it back. Kelsey learned about the European withdrawal in late November and December 1961. She had been right in ways she had not yet fully articulated. She had been right for one set of reasons: the peripheral neuropathy data, the inadequate safety disclosure, and the drug had been dangerous for a different, worse reason that she had not yet known about: the teratogenicity, the damage to the developing embryo, the 10,000 children. The story of Frances Kelsey and thalidomide became publicly known in July 1962 when a journalist named Morton Mintz published a front-page story in the Washington Post describing how a single FDA reviewer had refused to approve a drug that was causing birth defects across the developed world. The story was accurate. It was also transformative in the way that certain pieces of journalism are transformative. It took a regulatory and scientific story and made it human, made it visible, made it the kind of thing that members of Congress needed to respond to. On August 7, 1962, President John F. Kennedy presented Frances Kelsey with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. It was among the highest honors available to a civilian government employee. The ceremony was public. The photographs show a woman of 47 receiving a certificate from the president with the composed, slightly surprised expression of someone who did not do what she did in order to receive anything in return. The award was deserved, the recognition was real and appropriate. But I want to say something carefully about what the story of Frances Kelsey actually illuminates, because it is sometimes told as a story of individual heroism in a way that, while not wrong, is incomplete. Kelsey was effective because she worked within a system that gave her the authority to say no and to make no stick. She could ask for more information. She could send the application back. The law provided her with the mechanism to do this, and her supervisors, under pressure from Richardson Merrill but also aware that the FDA's authority depended on precisely this kind of reviewer independence, did not override her. She was effective because the system she worked within, however imperfect, was designed to accommodate her specific kind of careful, evidence-based refusal. The tragedy of the 40-odd other countries where thalidomide was sold is not that those countries lacked a Frances Kelsey. They almost certainly contain people with exactly the kind of careful, pharmacologically sophisticated, appropriately skeptical professional mind that Kelsey brought to her work. The tragedy is that those countries' regulatory systems did not provide those people with the mechanisms that Kelsey had, did not require a formal approval process before drugs could be marketed, did not provide reviewers with the authority to refuse and to make refusal stick on the basis of inadequate safety data. Kelsey mattered. Genuinely, enormously, specifically mattered. 17 families in America did not carry what 10,000 families in the rest of the world carried because of Frances Kelsey's refusals. But the mechanism she worked within mattered too. And the story of what happened in the rest of the world is, in part, the story of what happens when you have the people but not the mechanism. I want to return to something about Frances Kelsey that tends to be underemphasized in the accounts that treat her story primarily as a story of individual courage. It is the question of what, specifically, made her read the Richardson-Merrill application the way she read it. The standard answer, the one that appears in most accounts, is that she was careful, that she was thorough, that she had the scientific training to read the pharmacological literature critically. All of this is true, but it doesn't fully explain why the peripheral neuropathy data that appeared in the European literature produced, in her, a specific concern about the drug's safety in pregnancy that was not producing the same concern in the regulatory and medical communities of the 40-odd countries where the drug was already on the market. The more specific answer goes back to the work she did in Eugene Geiling's laboratory in the late 1930s. There, she had been part of the team that studied what happened to certain drugs in pregnant animals, and specifically the ways in which certain compounds cross the placental barrier and behave differently in the developing fetus than they did in the adult organism. This was not abstract training in teratology, it was direct experimental experience with the principle that the placenta was not a complete filter and that the developing organism might respond to a compound in ways that could not be predicted from the adult response. When she read the Richardson-Merrill application for a sedative drug that had produced evidence of peripheral neuropathy in adult users, the neurological component of that side effect activated a specific professional concern that her earlier research had placed there. A drug that affected the peripheral nervous system in adults, that produced measurable damage to nerve tissue in people who had been using it for extended periods, posed for her an immediate and specific question about what that drug might do to the nervous system of a developing embryo. The answer to that question was not in the Richardson-Merrill application. The application did not address it. This absence, for Kelsey, was a reason to withhold approval until the question was answered. For the company, the absence was invisible because the question had not yet been asked. The other thing that made Kelsey's position sustainable, not just courageous but institutionally viable, was the specific nature of the FDA's review process at that time. The rules under which she was working gave her the authority to ask for additional information and to continue asking for it, for as long as her professional assessment indicated that the information provided was inadequate to support approval. Richardson-Merrill could not compel approval. They could submit revised applications, and they could apply pressure, and they could complain to Kelsey's supervisors, and they did all of these things, but they could not override a professional medical determination that the evidence was insufficient. This structural protection was not the result of lucky circumstance. It was the result of deliberate regulatory design, the design of a review process that was meant to make professional medical judgment, rather than commercial pressure, the determining factor in approval decisions. The design was not perfect, and the FDA of 1960 was not without its own institutional pressures and imperfections. But it contained, in this specific provision, the mechanism that made Kelsey's refusal effective rather than merely principled. There is a detail about the sample distribution by Richardson-Merrill that is often noted briefly but that deserves a fuller accounting. The 2.5 million tablets distributed to 1,267 doctors before FDA approval were not a marginal or tentative operation, they represented a deliberately planned commercial strategy. The investigational drug provision under the existing law allowed pharmaceutical companies to distribute unapproved drugs to physicians under the label of clinical investigation, and Richardson-Merrill used this provision extensively, distributing thalidomide across the United States in quantities that would, if anything like normal prescribing rates applied, have reached a very large number of patients. The physicians who received these samples were required, under the provisions of the investigational framework, to obtain informed consent from their patients. The evidence that emerged subsequently suggested that many of them did not, in practice, do this with any consistency. Patients received the drug without being told it was investigational, without being told it had not been approved for sale in the United States, and without being given the information about its status that would have allowed them to make an informed decision. This was a widespread failure of professional ethics by the physicians involved, a failure enabled by the regulatory framework that permitted the distribution and did not adequately enforce the consent requirements. When the Washington Post story appeared in July 1962, it produced a particular kind of public and political response. The response that occurs when the abstract becomes concrete, when the policy question acquires the human face that makes it impossible to treat as merely procedural. Senators who had been receiving lobbying from the pharmaceutical industry against regulatory reform had, after Morton Mintz's story, a very different political calculus. The drug that had caused birth defects across Europe had been kept out of America by one FDA reviewer. The reviewer was a woman. She had been pressured and dismissed, and her professional judgment had been questioned. She had been right. The political opportunity this created for meaningful regulatory reform was, as political opportunities go, unusually clear. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment passed in October 1962 with almost no opposition. Senator Estes Kefauver, who had been working on pharmaceutical legislation for years before the thalidomide story became public, found that the political conditions that had previously made his proposals controversial had been transformed overnight. The pharmaceutical industry lobbying that had been effective in 1961 was not effective in 1962 because the members of Congress who received it were now receiving it in a context where the public had a clear and vivid understanding of what inadequate pharmaceutical regulation looked like. The withdrawal of thalidomide from the market in the final weeks of 1961 did not produce immediately anything like a public understanding of what had happened. The news moved through the world in the way that news moved in that era, through the press, through medical channels, through the informal professional networks that connected physicians across national borders, and through the particular unevenness that is produced when information has no single mechanism by which it travels. Parents who had had affected children did not necessarily know yet what had caused what they were experiencing. The diagnosis, thalidomide embryopathy, became the clinical term used to describe the constellation of effects that the drug had produced in children whose mothers had taken it in the first trimester, required a physician who knew what to look for and who took a careful medication history and who had enough pieces of the picture to see its shape. In late 1961 and early 1962, not every physician who encountered an affected child had all of these things. Some families were given the diagnosis quickly, with appropriate explanation and support. Others were not, and carried the experience of unexplained difference in their children for months before the picture was completed. Let me tell you what the condition actually meant for the children who had it, because the aggregate statistics, 10,000 children worldwide, a number that is repeated in the literature and in this account, and that is important, and is also, in the way of all large numbers, insufficient, can obscure the particular. Thalidomide embryopathy presented across a wide spectrum. Some children were affected in relatively limited ways, a single limb partially shortened, an effect manageable with prosthetics and adaptive equipment that in later decades would become genuinely sophisticated. Other children were more severely affected, multiple limbs involved or limbs absent to a degree that made the standard prosthetics of the early 1960s inadequate. Some had additional effects to their internal organs, the heart, the kidneys, or to their senses. The ears were sometimes affected, producing deafness, the eyes occasionally, the face itself in some cases. The mortality rate among affected children in their first year of life was, by some estimates, approximately 40%. This figure encompasses the most severely affected infants, those for whom the disruption to normal development had been extensive enough to compromise vital function. Many of the children who survived infancy were otherwise healthy in the specific sense that their brains, their internal organs in most cases, their cognitive capacities were unaffected. They were babies in every way except the particular ways they were not. They cried, they slept, they fed. They looked at their parents with the focused, absorbing attention that newborns bring to the faces of their parents, and their parents looked back at them. What the parents were experiencing in those first hours and days is very hard to describe from the outside, and the accounts that exist in interviews conducted with families over the decades that followed, in memoirs and testimonies, and the documentary record that organizations like the Thalidomide Trust in the United Kingdom have assembled suggest a range that resists summary. Some families describe the experience of encountering their affected child with an immediacy that left no room for anything but response. The child was here, the child needed care, and the care began. Others describe a more complicated arrival, the shock that took time to process, the grief that arrived alongside the love, the particular difficulty of a future that had been imagined in one way and had arrived in another. There were also families who did not keep their children. This is a detail that exists in the record and that belongs in an honest account of what happened. Some families, in the first shock of the diagnosis, and in an era when medical professionals sometimes advised institutionalization for children with significant physical differences, did place their affected children in care. Some physicians told families that the child could not have a normal life and offered the alternative of institutional care as though this were a clinical decision rather than a social one. Some families followed this advice and spent subsequent decades during which understanding of what was possible for people with physical differences expanded enormously with that decision. Other families kept their children and built around them lives of extraordinary adaptability. Modifications were made, methods were found. The human capacity to reorganize around what is, rather than what was expected, is real. It is not uniform and it is not always easy, and it does not cancel what was lost, but it is real. In the households where affected children grew up with their families, a different kind of ordinary was constructed. The ordinary of families who figure out what their specific child can and cannot do, and build a world that works for that specific child. The legal proceedings that followed the thalidomide disaster were among the most protracted and ultimately unsatisfying in the history of pharmaceutical litigation. In West Germany, criminal proceedings against executives of Chemie Grünenthal were initiated in 1968. The case, which became the longest criminal trial in West German legal history, proceeded through the courts with a slowness that became its own kind of verdict. In December 1970, the trial was dismissed. No one was convicted. The dismissal rested on legal arguments about the state of scientific knowledge at the time the drug was sold, about whether the harm could have been foreseen by the standards of the era, and on procedural considerations that, in the legal system's internal logic, were sufficient to end the proceedings. Grünenthal paid compensation to West German survivors, eventually. The payments arrived after pressure from legal actions and from the public attention that the trial had generated. But the criminal accountability that many families had sought, the formal acknowledgement by the legal system that specific people had made specific wrong decisions that caused specific harm, that did not come. In the United Kingdom, the story was different but not better. The distillers company, which had manufactured and sold Distaval in Britain, initially contested liability and fought the compensation claims of affected families through the courts with considerable vigour. The legal battle ran through the 1960s without resolution in a direction that satisfied the families involved. What eventually changed the situation in Britain was not the law exactly, but journalism. A campaign in the Sunday Times newspaper, driven by editor Harold Evans and beginning in 1967, brought sustained public attention to the plight of British thalidomide survivors and to the inadequacy of the compensation distillers was offering. The campaign published detailed accounts of the survivors' lives, of the legal obstacles they faced, of the contrast between the company's financial resources and the resources of the families it had harmed. It generated public pressure that distillers found over years increasingly impossible to resist. The campaign also generated a legal confrontation of its own. The courts ruled that the Sunday Times' coverage constituted a contempt of court, that by publishing while the litigation was active, the newspaper had interfered with the legal process. The Sunday Times challenged this ruling all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, which in 1979 ruled in the newspaper's favour. The case established an important precedent in European press law. It was, in the way of thalidomide's consequences, a victory that came late and in an unexpected direction, not for the survivors directly, but for the freedom of the press to report on matters of public interest. A settlement was eventually reached in the United Kingdom, and compensation was paid. The Thalidomide Trust was established with some of that compensation to provide ongoing support to British survivors. The trust continues to operate. British thalidomide survivors, there are estimated to be a few hundred still living, are now in their 60s, and the Trust provides financial support, medical assistance, and community to a population of people whose needs have changed significantly as they have entered middle and older age. Because here is something that the thalidomide story includes that is not always discussed. The consequences of the drug did not end in 1961 with the withdrawal. They continued into the lives of the affected children as they grew, and they have continued to evolve as those children became adults and those adults have aged. Joints that were always different from those of people whose limbs formed normally have over 60 years of compensatory use, worn in particular ways. Shoulders and elbows that have carried loads they were not designed for have developed the distinctive wear of structures overworked. Bodies that developed adaptations in childhood to perform functions differently are finding those adaptations less reliable in their 6th decade of use. The world into which the thalidomide generation was born was not, in the early 1960s, designed with them in mind. Schools were not always accessible. Work environments were not always accessible. The social world was not always kind. Some of the accounts that survivors have given over the years describe the experience of growing up in that world, the stares, the questions, the occasional cruelty of children, and the more carefully phrased but sometimes equally painful conduct of adults who did not know how to behave. And then, because people are remarkable in the ways they are remarkable, many of these same accounts describe the careers built, the relationships formed, the things accomplished. The thalidomide generation includes architects and musicians and lawyers and doctors and parents of their own children. They include people who have spent significant portions of their lives as advocates for disability rights, for pharmaceutical accountability, for the kinds of regulatory reforms that might prevent similar disasters. Their experience shaped their perspectives in ways that have been, in some cases, deployed with considerable force toward making the world better. The regulatory changes that the thalidomide disaster produced were significant, if somewhat slower than the urgency of the situation would have implied. In the United States, the most immediate regulatory response was the passage of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in October 1962. The amendment was named after Senator Estes Kefauver and Representative Orrin Harris, who had been working on pharmaceutical regulation reform before the thalidomide story became public. Kefauver had been concerned separately about the pricing and marketing practices of the pharmaceutical industry. The thalidomide story provided the political energy to pass a bill that might otherwise have stalled. The amendment made 2 substantial changes to American drug law that had lasting significance. First, it required that drugs be proved not only safe but effective, a requirement that had not previously existed. Before 1962, you could obtain FDA approval for a drug if you could demonstrate that it would not harm people without being required to demonstrate that it would help them. This was, in retrospect, a remarkable gap in the framework, and the amendment closed it. Second, it gave the FDA considerably more authority over the clinical investigation of drugs, including the kind of investigational distribution that had allowed Richardson Merrill to put 2.5 million tablets into American physicians' hands before approval. The amendment passed with remarkable speed and near unanimous support in both chambers of Congress. The thalidomide story had done something that regulatory arguments rarely accomplish. It had made abstract questions about drug approval vivid, personal, and visible to every legislator who had read a newspaper in the preceding months. In other countries, regulatory reform moved more slowly and with more variation. Each nation reviewed its drug approval framework in the wake of the disaster, and most moved in the direction of requiring more rigorous pre-market evidence, including teratogenicity testing. The principle that drugs must be tested for their effects on developing embryos before being prescribed to pregnant women became gradually a standard requirement. The principle that adverse events must be reported systematically and completely became more firmly embedded in regulatory expectation. The principle that pharmaceutical companies could not rely on inadequate testing and selective disclosure to bring products to market became, at least in formal regulatory terms, more clearly enforced. But principles embedded in regulatory frameworks are only as effective as the mechanisms for enforcing them, and the history of pharmaceutical regulation since thalidomide is not a story of uncomplicated progress. New disasters have arisen, new drugs have been found to cause harms that pre-market testing did not reveal, new controversies about the adequacy of safety data, the transparency of adverse event reporting, and the management of information by pharmaceutical companies have appeared in the decades that followed. This is not to say that the lesson was not learned. It was learned. The world is safer for pregnant women taking medication than it was before thalidomide. The regulatory framework is more robust. The requirement for teratogenicity testing is real and enforced. These are genuine improvements paid for in the specific currency of what happened to 10,000 children and their families. It is only to say that the lesson required the harm, and that the mechanisms that produce the harm, the financial pressures of pharmaceutical development, the institutional tendency to manage uncomfortable information in commercially comfortable ways, the regulatory gaps that persist even in well-intentioned systems, are structural features of the relationship between industry, regulation, and the public that cannot be resolved once and for all, but require continuous attention. The babies born in 1959 and 1960 and 1961 are now in their 60s. They are living their lives. The story of what happened to them did not end in the years described in the documents and the legal proceedings. It is still happening, in the ordinary sense that the people to whom extraordinary things happened are still ordinary people living forward in time. The legal aftermath of the thalidomide disaster is one of the most instructive and unsatisfying chapters of the whole story, and I want to give it more of the attention it deserves. The German criminal proceedings that began in 1968 were, in principle, the appropriate mechanism for establishing legal accountability for the decisions that had caused the deaths and injuries of more than 10,000 children. The criminal law exists, among other purposes, to assign blame to specific people for specific decisions that caused specific harm. The thalidomide disaster had specific people at its center, the executives and medical staff at Grünenthal who had made the decisions about testing, marketing, adverse event management, and the timing of the withdrawal. These were identifiable people who had made identifiable decisions. The criminal law should, in principle, have been able to reach them. The proceedings ran for 2 years between 1968 and 1970 and involved documentation so extensive that the physical evidence files filled multiple rooms. The charge that the prosecution was attempting to establish was essentially criminal negligence, that the defendants had known, or should have known, of the teratogenic risk and had failed to take action that the knowledge required. The defense argued that the scientific state of knowledge at the time did not support the conclusion that the defendants should have acted differently, that teratogenicity testing was not a standard requirement, that the animal data that existed did not predict the human effect, that the knowledge to foresee the harm was not available to the defendants when the decisions were made. The court dismissed the case in December 1970. The reasoning that justified dismissal included, among other elements, the argument that the prolongation of the proceedings had itself become a burden on the defendants that the ends of justice could not justify. This was a procedural argument of a kind that is available in legal systems that recognize the right of defendants to a timely trial. It was also to the families who had spent years in the expectation that the legal system would reach a verdict on what had been done, an outcome of considerable bitterness. No one was convicted. No executive of Grünenthal served any period of imprisonment in connection with the thalidomide disaster. The company paid compensation, eventually under various forms of pressure, in amounts that were debated and negotiated and disputed for years, but the criminal accountability that many families considered the appropriate response to the specific failures that had been documented in the proceedings was never established. In the United Kingdom, the Distillers Company, the whiskey manufacturers who held the British license for thalidomide under the Distaval brand, adopted an initial legal position of contesting liability. This position was maintained through the early 1960s, while families whose children had been affected attempted to establish their legal claims. The intersection of a complex product liability question, a legal system that had not developed clear rules for this kind of pharmaceutical harm, and a well-resourced defendant with interests in minimizing the financial outcome produced a situation in which the family's legal position was genuinely weak and genuinely difficult. What changed the dynamics in Britain was Harold Evans and the Sunday Times. Evans, who became editor of the Sunday Times in 1967, was a journalist of the specific type that occasionally emerges in media organizations, the type who identifies a story not as a news event to be covered, but as a sustained injustice that requires the resources of a major publication applied over an extended period. He commissioned and published investigation after investigation into the situation of British thalidomide survivors, their daily lives, the difficulties they faced, the inadequacy of the compensation they had been offered, the contrast between distillers' financial position and the position of the families pursuing claims against it. The campaign asked, explicitly and publicly, whether a company that had sold a defective product should be compelled to provide adequate compensation to the people that product had harmed. This question had a clear answer in the minds of most people who read it. The complication was that expressing this view publicly while the litigation was active was what the English law of contempt of court prohibited. You could not publish statements likely to prejudice the outcome of pending proceedings. Evans and the Sunday Times fought this prohibition through the courts and eventually to the European Court of Human Rights, where the ruling in their favour established the principle that press freedom under the European Convention on Human Rights was not suspended by the existence of civil litigation. This was a significant legal victory for the press, for the principle of open reporting on matters of public concern. For the thalidomide survivors, it was a somewhat abstract victory in the context of what they had actually needed, which was adequate compensation for their injuries. That compensation came eventually. Distillers reached a settlement, and the Thalidomide Trust was established from the settlement funds, but it came after many years of legal struggle and public campaigning that the families should not have had to conduct. The trust that was established from those funds has been, by most accounts, a genuinely useful institution. It has provided financial support, medical assistance, and community to British survivors over more than 5 decades. It has also had to adapt continuously to the changing needs of a population whose bodies have aged in the particular ways that thalidomide-affected bodies age, the compensatory muscle and joint adaptations of early life becoming the sources of pain and restriction in later life. People who learn to carry out specific tasks in specific ways as children have found in their 50s and 60s that those adaptations are no longer available to them. This requires not just ongoing financial support, but ongoing medical understanding that specifically addresses what happens to these bodies across a lifetime. Here is something strange about this story, and I want to sit with the strangeness for a moment before we continue. The drug that caused the disaster is still in use. Thalidomide, the same compound, the same molecule under the brand name Thalidomide, was approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration in 1998 for the treatment of a painful and debilitating inflammatory complication of leprosy called erythema nodosum leprosum. It was approved under conditions that are, by the standards of American drug regulation, the most stringent that have been applied to any single medication in the system's history. Every patient who receives the drug must be enrolled in a special monitoring program. Every patient receives counseling about the specific and severe risks of the drug in pregnancy. Every patient of childbearing age is required to use contraception and to submit to regular pregnancy testing. The program is called STEPS, the System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety, and its existence is both a reflection of how much has changed since 1957 and an ongoing acknowledgement of what it cost to produce those changes. In 2006, thalidomide was additionally approved by the FDA for the treatment of multiple myeloma, a cancer of plasma cells in the bone marrow. The drug had been found in the late 1990s by a physician named Judah Folkman, who had spent much of his career studying tumor biology, to have anti-angiogenic properties. It inhibits the formation of blood vessels, which tumors require to grow. This discovery gave thalidomide a second life in oncology, and that second life has been genuinely beneficial. People with multiple myeloma live longer because of thalidomide and its derivatives. People with the leprosy complication it was approved for are relieved of significant pain. The same compound, a different world. A world with the regulations and the monitoring and the institutional memory that the 1950s did not have. This is a fact that the story of thalidomide contains and cannot resolve because it resists resolution. The molecule that caused catastrophic harm when given to pregnant women without testing is, when given to non-pregnant adults under careful supervision with thorough monitoring, a beneficial medicine. This does not make the harm smaller, It does not make the people who were harmed more acceptable as the cost of a benefit that arrived decades later, but it is part of the full picture of what thalidomide is, and a full account of the story requires acknowledging it. There is also something that we have learned about the molecule itself in the decades since the disaster that adds a layer of scientific complexity that I find interesting in the way that details which illuminate the limits of knowledge are always interesting. Thalidomide exists as two enantiomers, mirror-image molecular forms, identical in their chemical composition, but different in the three-dimensional arrangement of their atoms. Your left hand and your right hand are a useful analogy, same number of fingers, same overall structure, but mirror images of each other that cannot be made to overlap. One enantiomer of thalidomide may have had the sedative and anti-nausea effects that made the drug commercially successful. The other may have been the teratogenic agent, the one that interfered with the development of the embryo. The hope, in the years after the mechanism became better understood, was that you could manufacture and use only the safe enantiomer, eliminating the dangerous one. The problem is that the two forms interconvert inside the body. The body's chemistry converts one form into the other, and back continuously. You cannot give someone only the safe version because the body will produce the other. The enantiomers cannot be separated in any clinically meaningful way. This molecular detail was not known in 1957, and its not being known was not a failure of Grünenthal specifically. It could not have been known because the science to understand it had not yet been developed. The specific failures of Grünenthal, the failure to conduct teratogenicity testing, the failure to fully disclose adverse events, the failure to respond with appropriate speed to Lenz's findings, were institutional and ethical failures, not scientific ones. The molecular complexity of the drug is a separate matter, but it is worth knowing because it is one of those places where the story of thalidomide intersects with the broader story of how genuinely difficult it is to fully understand what a drug does inside a living body. Now, I want to tell you about Brazil because the Brazilian chapter of the thalidomide story is both less well known than the European chapters and in some respects more troubling in what it reveals about the persistence of institutional failure. In Brazil, thalidomide was sold under the name Sedative from 1958 onward. When the European withdrawal occurred in late 1961, the Brazilian response was partial and delayed. The drug was withdrawn for its original uses, the sleeping pill and morning sickness applications, but then something happened that no other country's thalidomide story includes. In 1965, thalidomide was approved in Brazil for the treatment of leprosy. Brazil had, and has, one of the highest rates of leprosy of any country in the world, and the drug proved genuinely effective for the painful inflammatory complications of the disease. The approval was, in the clinical sense, justified. What was not adequate for many years were the safeguards around that approval. The monitoring systems that should have ensured the drug was given only to patients for whom pregnancy was not a risk were insufficient. Communication about the drug's dangers to pregnant women was incomplete. Women with leprosy who were also pregnant, leprosy and pregnancy are not mutually exclusive, received the drug. More children were born with thalidomide-related birth defects in Brazil, not in 1962 or 1963, but in 1975 and 1985 and 1990. Brazil today has more thalidomide-affected survivors than any country in the world except Germany, and the Brazilian survivors are, on average, much younger than their German counterparts. The Brazilian survivors did not receive the drug in the period that everyone thinks of as the thalidomide era. They received it decades later, in a context where the European experience should have been protection enough. The failure of that protection to function adequately in the Brazilian context is a story about the uneven spread of medical regulation, about the ways that pharmaceutical disasters in wealthy countries produce consequences, regulatory changes, monitoring requirements, institutional memory that do not automatically transfer to countries with different resources and different regulatory capacities. Let me come back now to the broader picture and to the question that the story of thalidomide poses when you look at it from enough distance to see its shape. What does a pharmaceutical disaster look like before you know it is a pharmaceutical disaster? It looks like a drug on a shelf. It looks like a prescription written with confidence by a physician who has no reason to doubt the safety claim made by the manufacturer. It looks like a patient who takes what she has been given and feels better and is grateful. It looks like a company filing its quarterly figures and expanding its licensing network and managing the difficult information in the way that institutions manage difficult information, slowly, with one eye on what the management of that information will cost. It looks like a regulatory system that was designed to catch the most visible kinds of harm, and that was not yet designed, because no one had learned yet that it needed to be to catch the specific kind of harm that was occurring. It looks entirely ordinary from the inside until it doesn't, and by the time it doesn't, the harm has been done. The thalidomide story is sometimes presented as a story whose lesson has been learned. The regulatory changes were real. Teratogenicity testing is now required. Adverse event reporting is more stringent. The FDA approval process is more rigorous. Frances Kelsey received her award and became a symbol of what careful review can accomplish. The world built better mechanisms. All of this is true, and also true is that the mechanisms that produce thalidomide, the financial pressures of bringing a product to market quickly, the institutional tendency to manage uncomfortable data in commercially convenient ways, the regulatory gaps that exist in every era because regulation always lags behind the pace of pharmaceutical development, are not unique to any particular era. They are structural features of the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry, the regulatory state, and the patients who are, in the end, the human beings on whom pharmaceutical products are ultimately tested. They appear in new configurations in every generation. In the 1970s, the drug diethylstilbestrol, DES, was found to cause a particular and devastating form of reproductive harm in the daughters of women who had taken it during pregnancy. It had been prescribed as a miscarriage preventative. It did not prevent miscarriages. It caused a rare form of vaginal cancer in the daughters of the women who took it, and reproductive problems in those daughters that extended across their own pregnancies. The harm was intergenerational in a way that thalidomides was not. The pattern? A drug prescribed to pregnant women without adequate safety testing for effects on the developing fetus, causing harm that was only visible years or decades later, was recognizably the same. In the 1990s, a diet drug combination called fen-phen, fenfluramine and phentermine was withdrawn after evidence emerged that it caused heart valve damage and a rare form of pulmonary hypertension. It had been prescribed to millions of people. The evidence of harm was real. The drug came off the market. Lawsuits followed. The pharmaceutical company paid enormous settlements. In 2004, the pain reliever Vioxx, a COX-2 inhibitor that had been specifically marketed as safer than traditional NSAIDs for the stomach, was withdrawn after evidence emerged that it significantly increased the risk of heart attack and stroke in people who took it long-term. The manufacturer, Merck, had been aware of concerning cardiovascular data and had managed that data in ways that a subsequent Senate Finance Committee investigation found to be inadequate. The drug had been taken by millions of people. The withdrawal was large and consequential. These are not identical stories. Each drug has its own chemistry and its own particular failure mode, but they share a shape. They share the shape of a system in which the mechanisms for catching certain kinds of harm are always somewhat behind the mechanisms for producing certain kinds of harm. They share the shape of institutions that are not, by nature, oriented toward disclosing information that would be commercially costly to disclose. What the women of 2026 might find familiar in this history, I say women specifically because it is women who have been disproportionately the subjects of the pharmaceutical experiments described in this story, as patients prescribed medications for conditions of reproduction and femininity and domestic management, often without adequate representation in the clinical trials that established those medications' safety profiles. What they might find familiar is the particular combination of trust and vulnerability that characterizes the relationship between a patient and a pharmaceutical system. The trust is real. The vulnerability is real. The system is, in most instances, genuinely trying to help. And the gaps between what the system knows and what it says, between what has been tested and what is claimed, between the information available to the patient and the information available to the manufacturer, those gaps are also real and they have consequences. This is not counsel for paranoia. It is counsel for the kind of informed engagement with pharmaceutical information that Kelsey exemplified from her specific position. The willingness to read carefully, to ask what questions have not been asked, to be satisfied with adequate evidence rather than confident marketing. Frances Kelsey continued to work at the FDA for many years after the thalidomide story. She eventually directed the Office of Scientific Investigation. She retired in 2005 at the age of 90. She died in 2015 at the age of 101. In the years before her death, she was still, by all accounts, sharp-minded and clear about why the work she had done mattered. Widukind Lentz continued his research in medical genetics. He is credited with saving an unknown but certainly large number of lives by making the connection he made when he made it, and with the specific kind of professional courage that the making of that connection publicly, under circumstances where the claim was extraordinary and the resistance would be real, required. William McBride continued his clinical career in Australia. He was celebrated for his independent identification of the thalidomide connection and was, in 1962, named Australian of the Year. Much later, this detail belongs in a full account because it is part of the full picture. He was found to have fabricated data in subsequent research on a different drug's effects on pregnancy. He was removed from the medical register in 1993. He appealed and was eventually reinstated. The later misconduct did not change the validity of the thalidomide finding. The evidence for that connection was independently established by Lenz and confirmed by extensive subsequent investigation, but it is there in the record, as complexity is always there in the records of complex lives. The apology from Chemie Grünenthal came in 2012, 50 years after the withdrawal. The company's chief executive delivered it at a ceremony at which survivors were present. It acknowledged what had happened. It expressed regret. It was the first formal acknowledgement from the company. Survivors and advocates received it with the kind of response that 50 years of waiting produces. Some found it meaningful, others found it inadequate. All of them had been waiting for it for a very long time, and the waiting had shaped the people who had been doing it. The story of thalidomide is, among other things, the story of what an apology means when it arrives 50 years late, and what justice means when no one is ever convicted, and what accountability means when the institution responsible for the harm is still in operation and still profitable half a century after the harm was done. These are not questions with clean answers. These are questions that pharmaceutical disasters tend to leave unresolved in the spaces where accountability should be. The Brazilian story is one that I keep returning to because it contains something that the European and American chapters of the thalidomide story do not: the failure to apply the lesson that had already been learned. By the time Brazil approved thalidomide for leprosy treatment in 1965, the European disaster was not a secret. The drug's teratogenic effects were documented in the medical literature in ways that were accessible to any physician or regulatory body with access to international journals. The animal models that could reproduce the teratogenic effect had been identified. The specific mechanism, the disruption of the development of limb buds in the critical early weeks of embryogenesis, was being studied in laboratories. The knowledge existed. What did not exist in adequate form was the implementation of that knowledge in the Brazilian regulatory context. The conditions attached to the approval for leprosy treatment did not include the monitoring systems that would, in the decades that followed, become standard practice in countries with more developed pharmacovigilance infrastructure. Women with leprosy who were also pregnant, and leprosy and pregnancy overlap in a population where both occur, were not systematically screened out of the patient population receiving the drug. The counseling about teratogenic risk that should have accompanied every prescription was not reliably delivered. The result was that babies with thalidomide-related birth defects were born in Brazil, not in 1959 and 1960 and 1961, but in 1975 and 1980 and 1985 and 1990 and beyond. Brazil's thalidomide survivors are, today, on average much younger than the German survivors whose experience prompted the disaster's recognition. Some are still being born. The World Health Organization and international advocacy organizations have documented cases of thalidomide exposure in Brazil as recently as the 2000s. This is not a failure that can be attributed to lack of knowledge. It is a failure of institutional implementation, of the translation of available knowledge into adequate practice at the level of the individual physician and the individual patient. It is also a failure that reflects the uneven way in which pharmaceutical disasters generate protective responses. The response is most robust where the disaster was most visible, and least robust where the disease burden that motivates the drug's continued use is highest. Brazil has more thalidomide survivors than any country except Germany. This is a fact that is not widely known outside of pharmaceutical policy circles and advocacy organizations, and that deserves to be known more widely because it illustrates something important about how the global experience of pharmaceutical risk is distributed. The harm of the 1957 to 1961 era fell disproportionately on wealthy, developed countries because those countries were the ones with the purchasing power to import and consume a new sedative from a West German pharmaceutical company. The harm of the subsequent decades fell disproportionately on Brazil because Brazil had the leprosy burden that the drug was effective against, and because Brazil lacked the regulatory capacity to protect its population from the drug's teratogenic effects as effectively as the United States STEPS program would eventually protect American patients. The rehabilitation of thalidomide as a medicine for multiple myeloma has added another dimension to this complicated picture. The drug's anti-angiogenic properties, its ability to inhibit the growth of blood vessels that tumors require, were discovered serendipitously. A physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute named Robert D'Amato, working in Judah Folkman's laboratory in the mid-1990s, was screening compounds for anti-angiogenic activity. Thalidomide was among those tested. Its activity was significant. The laboratory findings led to clinical trials. The clinical trials demonstrated efficacy in multiple myeloma. The FDA approval in 2006 followed. The oncologists who use thalidomide in the treatment of multiple myeloma today are prescribing a drug that, in their clinical assessment, offers their patients a meaningful extension of life. This is not a small thing. Multiple myeloma is a serious cancer with limited treatment options, and the response rates to thalidomide-based regimens have been significant enough that the drug has become part of standard treatment protocols. The people who are alive today because of thalidomide treatment for multiple myeloma are real people with real lives who have been genuinely helped by the drug. This is part of the thalidomide story too. The STEPS program through which thalidomide is prescribed in the United States is, in its design, an implicit acknowledgement of everything that went wrong in 1957. Every element of the program, the mandatory enrollment, the required counseling, the contraception requirements, the pregnancy testing door addresses a specific failure that the original market authorization enabled. It is, in a very direct sense, a harm prevention framework built from the specific anatomy of a harm. The care with which it was designed reflects the weight of what it was designed to prevent from happening again. Whether you find this reassuring or troubling probably depends on your temperament. The same molecule that caused the disaster is being carefully managed toward the alleviation of cancer. The knowledge gained from the disaster has been built into a prevention framework that has, by all available evidence, been effective. There have been no confirmed thalidomide-related birth defects in the United States since the drug was reapproved under STEPS in 1998. The lesson, in this specific context, was learned well enough to prevent the recurrence of the specific harm that prompted the lesson. What remains are the structural features of the pharmaceutical system that produced the original disaster, the financial pressures that create incentives to bring products to market quickly, the institutional dynamics that make the management of inconvenient data a recurring temptation, the regulatory frameworks that are always somewhat behind the pace of pharmaceutical innovation. These are not features that any single lesson can eliminate. They are features of a system that cannot be solved once, but must be managed continuously by the specific people in the specific roles that management requires, making the specific decisions that the situation in front of them requires with whatever information and whatever mechanisms the moment provides. Francis Kelsey had the information, the mechanisms, and the judgment to use them. Not every moment produces a Francis Kelsey. Not every regulatory system gives its Francis Kelsey the tools she needs. This is the condition of pharmaceutical safety. It depends on the confluence of the right person, the right system, and the right moment in a world that does not reliably produce all three at once. When I think about this story, and I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about it, turning it over the way you turn over a stone and keep finding things you did not expect underneath, what strikes me most is not the dramatic elements. Not the criminal proceedings that went nowhere, and not the award ceremony with the president, and not even the specific numbers, large as those numbers are. What strikes me most is the quiet middle of it. The years between 1957 and 1961 when everything was happening and nothing was visible, when the harm was accumulating in a way that produced no visible signal in the most ordinary settings of ordinary life. The kitchen, the bathroom cabinet, the morning cup of tea, the tablet that tasted like nothing and did what it said. The women who took thalidomide during their pregnancies were not, in the years I have been describing, aware of being part of a pharmaceutical disaster. They were aware of being pregnant, which is its own absorbing and all-encompassing condition. They were aware of the particular quality of the nausea in the mornings and of the relief when the nausea quieted. They were aware of the husband at work, and the shopping to be done, and the room to be cleared for the cot that would be borrowed, and the walls that needed to be repainted in a colour that was not yet decided. Their daily experience, the texture of their days in the months when the harm was occurring, was entirely ordinary. This is the part of the thalidomide story that tends to be missing from the accounts that focus on the pharmaceutical company and the regulatory drama and the legal proceedings. The women themselves, the specific daily lives they were living while the specific daily action of the drug was occurring in their bodies, are often peripheral in the larger narrative. Let me try to stay with them for a moment, because I think there is something in the experience of these women that the larger narrative tends to obscure and that deserves to be seen clearly. They trusted. Not blindly, they trusted in the way that people who have been given good reasons to trust do trust. Their doctors were real doctors, with real training, genuinely trying to help them. The pharmaceutical system that had produced the drug was a real system, operating within real frameworks, staffed by real people who believed in most cases that they were doing their work properly. The cultural message of the era about pharmaceutical progress was not a lie. Pharmaceutical progress was real and had delivered genuine benefits. The trust was reasonable. And the trust was wrong. Not through any failure of the women themselves, but through the specific failure of the people and institutions that had given them reasons to trust. The testing that had not been done, the adverse events that had not been fully disclosed, the marketing language that had claimed a certainty that the evidence did not support, the regulatory frameworks that had not required what should have been required. The gap between what these women were told, completely safe, even for pregnant women, even for children, and what was true is a gap that belongs to the people who built the gap, not to the people who walked into it. I think about what they experienced when the diagnosis arrived, when the physician, a different physician, in a different setting, months after the prescription had been written and forgotten, explained what they were looking at. The accounts that survive, in interviews and memoirs, and the oral histories that various organizations have collected over the years, suggest that the experience of receiving this information was various and complex in the way that the experiences of people who have been seriously harmed always are. Some women describe a particular quality of displacement. The sense that the story of the pregnancy that had been progressing toward one outcome had turned into a different story with a different end, and the adjustment required to inhabit the new story while still being in the old one. Some describe guilt, not the guilt of people who have done something wrong. They had done nothing wrong, but the peculiar guilt of people who have been given something to feel bad about and who find, despite knowing better, that they feel it anyway. The mind's first response to harm is often to reach for agency. What did I do? What could I have done differently? What would have happened if? These questions have no good answers in this case because the answers are all the same. You took what you were given, which is what everyone told you to do. Some describe anger. This is perhaps the most legible of the responses, the one that most clearly tracks the shape of what actually happened. Anger at the company, anger at the inadequacy of the testing, anger at the physicians who prescribed without more information than they had been given, anger at the regulatory systems that had not asked for the right questions. The anger is appropriate. It has been, in some of the women and families involved, a source of sustained energy for advocacy and for the pursuit of accountability over decades. Some describe, alongside and not instead of the grief and the anger, the practical focus that becomes necessary when you have a child who needs care and there is no time to stand in any one feeling for very long. This practical focus is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of feeling organized into the shape that the circumstances require. The children grew. Time moved forward. The decade of the 1960s became the decade of the 1970s, and the thalidomide children became teenagers, and then adults, and then middle-aged people in their own right. The world through which they moved changed around them. The accessibility of built environments improved, unevenly. The understanding of what people with physical differences could accomplish expanded, sometimes ahead of the world's willingness to accommodate it, and sometimes because of the insistence of the people in question. Some of them have spoken and written about their lives in ways that make clear that the life lived with the consequences of thalidomide was not only the story of those consequences, it was also the story of everything else: the work, the relationships, the places visited, the things achieved, the ordinary accumulation of experience that constitutes a human life regardless of its specific configuration. They are not one thing, these lives. They were not one thing even from the beginning. There is a kind of historical injustice that this story exemplifies, a kind that I want to name because naming it seems important. It is the kind that happens not dramatically, but quietly, in kitchens and bedrooms and doctors' offices, in the unwitnessed moments of ordinary decisions, in the space between what the system said was true and what was actually true, in the months when the truth and the official story were very far apart and no one with sufficient authority had yet said so. This kind of injustice accumulates without making much noise. It produces no single dramatic moment that functions as the event the story centers on. Instead, it produces a pattern of individual experiences, millions of them in the case of thalidomide, across more than 40 countries, each one ordinary from the inside and only visible as part of something larger when someone stands back far enough to see the shape. The pattern, when it becomes visible, is undeniable and large, but it became visible only after it had already done its damage. The women who were most harmed by it, the women who took the morning pill and were grateful for it, and then months later were in a different story than the one they had been living, were in the most specific sense the people whose experience is hardest to see in the historical record. Because the historical record in cases like this tends to center on the people who identified the problem, on Lenz, on McBride, on Kelsey, on the regulatory debate and the legal proceedings and the congressional hearings and the award ceremonies. These people matter. Their contributions were real and, in Kelsey's case, directly life-saving. But they are not the people on whose bodies the harm occurred. The bodies on which the harm occurred were the bodies of women in their first trimesters and of the children who were forming inside them. Those bodies are the ground on which the entire story stands, and they are not always at the center of the way the story is told. The mothers of the 10,000 made the regulatory system safer, not because anyone asked them to, not because their experience was acknowledged in the legislative hearings or the journal articles or the policy documents, because what happened to them was undeniable enough and large enough and eventually visible enough that it forced the people with regulatory authority to build better mechanisms. The lesson required the harm required the mothers, and the mothers received no credit for the lesson that the world drew from their experience. This is the particular kind of historical injustice that happens quietly, in kitchens, over decades, and is only visible in retrospect. The women to whom it happened are not famous. Most of them are not remembered by name in the broader public record of the disaster. They are present in the aggregate statistics, the numbers of affected pregnancies, the numbers of affected children, and in the oral histories and the patient records and the interviews that researchers and advocates have collected over 50 years. They are present, in other words, in the specific and particular evidence that history tends to generate, but that the summaries of history tend to lose. I find in their accounts, in the fragments that have survived in accessible form, something that I want to describe as dignity, though the word is almost too small for what I mean. It is the dignity not of people who have transcended their experience, but of people who have inhabited it fully, who have let it be what it was without requiring it to be anything else, and who have moved through it and beyond it in the ordinary way that people move through and beyond the hardest things that happen to them. The world looked at their children and saw the evidence of a pharmaceutical disaster. The women who carried those children knew the evidence as a person, as the specific child they had brought home, whose face they knew, whose needs they understood, whose presence they organized their days around. These are the same thing, and they are not the same thing. The aggregate and the particular are always both true simultaneously, and the aggregate is always, in the end, composed of particulars so specific that no aggregate can fully contain them. There is a bottle in this story, small, orange, ordinary, on a bathroom shelf in the early 1960s in a country that believed in progress, in a decade that believed in medicine. The women who reached for that bottle each morning were reaching for what the era had made available to them. Relief. The ordinary human need for things that hurt to stop hurting. The ordinary human willingness to trust the systems that have been built around you, the way that all of us trust the systems built around us until we have specific reason not to. Their trust was not the error was what was done with their trust. The bottle is gone from the shelf. It has been gone for more than 60 years. The system that put it there has been changed in real and significant ways, though it has not been perfected, because it cannot be perfected, because the relationship between pharmaceutical development and pharmaceutical risk is one that requires continuous attention rather than any single and final resolution. The women who took the morning tablet have mostly died now of the ordinary causes of age. Their children are in their 60s. The lesson that was drawn from what happened to all of them is embedded in the regulatory frameworks that govern the testing of drugs today, in the requirements for teratogenicity testing and adverse event reporting, and the transparency that the systems of the early 1960s did not require. The women paid for the lesson. The world received it. The account between them will never fully balance. And yet here we are, in the particular piece of the small hours, knowing the full shape of the story, knowing what the bottle contained and what it cost and what the world built from the cost, knowing the women in the kitchens and the physician at his desk and the man in Hamburg counting his patient files and the woman in Washington reading an application carefully and finding it insufficient, knowing all of it from beginning to end, in the quiet way that knowing something completely and at a distance from the urgency of its happening is possible. It is a kind of peace, this knowing, not the peace of resolution exactly, not the peace of justice which has not fully arrived, but the peace of comprehension, of having heard the story all the way through to the place where the bottle is no longer on the shelf and the world is not the same as it was and the people who inhabited the story have lived their lives and the thing that happened is understood well enough to be, at last, at rest. I want to try to say something about what this story is, at the level below the facts. At the level of the facts, it is a story about a drug, about the companies that made and sold it, the physicians who prescribed it, the regulatory systems that should have caught it and mostly didn't, about the specific people who were harmed and the specific people who prevented some of the harm and the specific people who were responsible for the harm and the specific ways in which they were or were not held accountable. These are all real things, and I have tried to tell them as accurately as I can. But below the facts, there is something else, and it is the thing that makes this story stick in the mind in the way that certain stories stick, that makes you think about it at odd moments, in the kitchen or the bathroom, as you are doing the things that people do in the rooms of their lives without thinking about them much. I think what's below the facts is a story about the relationship between trust and knowledge, about what it means to trust systems that know more than you do about things that matter enormously to you, about the gap between what the systems say and what the systems know, and about who lives in that gap. We are all continuously in a version of the situation that the women in those kitchens were in. We are all taking things and doing things and operating within systems that we trust on the basis of the information they have provided to us, without having the capacity to independently verify everything we have been told. This is not a failure of our intelligence or our critical capacity. It is a feature of the complexity of the world we live in, which exceeds what any individual can personally verify. We are dependent on institutions, and the question is not how to become independent of them. That independence is not available, but how to build them well enough that the trust they require is deserved. The thalidomide story shows what happens when the trust is not deserved. Not because anyone decided to betray it, exactly. There are very few moments in this story that rise to the level of deliberate deception, and most of the people in the chain, from the physicians to the pharmacists to the regulatory bodies of the countries involved, were operating in good faith with the information they had. The failure was structural. The gap between what was known and what was said was produced not by individual malice, but by institutional patterns. The pattern of testing what was required rather than what was sufficient, of disclosing what was obligatory rather than what was complete, of managing risk to the institution at the cost of transparency to the public. This kind of structural failure is harder to be angry at than deliberate deception. It is harder to prosecute, as the German criminal proceedings demonstrated. It is harder to fix because it requires not the removal of bad actors, but the redesign of incentive structures and accountability mechanisms in ways that are technically and politically complex. And it is easier to repeat because the structural conditions that produced it, the financial pressures of pharmaceutical development, the informational asymmetries between manufacturers and regulators, the difficulty of detecting harms that develop slowly and at the population level, remain present in every generation of pharmaceutical regulation. What I'm left with, after spending the better part of a night in this story, is not primarily anger, though the anger is there. It is something more like grief at the particular shape of the thing, at the fact that the women in the kitchens were doing what they should have done, and that the harm found them anyway. At the fact that the systems that should have protected them didn't, not because the protection was impossible, but because the systems were not designed with enough care. At the fact that the lesson was learned, and that learning it required what learning it required. And alongside the grief, because stories like this are complicated enough to hold more than one thing, a kind of recognition. The recognition that the world built something from what happened. That the specific failures of 1957 and 1958 and 1959 and 1960 produced eventually specific improvements in the mechanisms that govern how drugs are tested and approved and monitored. That Frances Kelsey was given the tools to do what she did because other people in other moments had identified the need for those tools. That the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which requires pharmaceutical companies to prove not just safety, but efficacy, exists because a set of people in specific legislative and administrative roles made specific decisions in the months after the thalidomide story became public. That the STEPS program, which has prevented any confirmed thalidomide-related birth defect in America since 1998, was designed by people who took the history seriously enough to build prevention into the structure of the approval. None of this balances the account. The account cannot be balanced, but it is something. It is the thing that remains, after the harm and the grief and the inadequate accountability and the long wait for a late apology. The fact that the world can learn even when the cost of learning is this high. The fact that the people who come after inherit not only the losses, but also the improvements that the losses made necessary. The women in the kitchens carried something that the world eventually built a structure around, not because anyone honored their carrying, but because the carrying was undeniable and the structure was needed. This is a kind of contribution that comes without choice and without credit. It is a contribution that the women did not ask to make and that the world does not adequately remember them for making, but it is real. It exists in the regulatory frameworks that protect the women of subsequent generations from some of the specific harms that found the women of 1957 and 1958 and 1959 and 1960. It is built into the mechanisms, invisibly, where most real contributions eventually end up. We do not know most of their names. We know the doctors' names, and the lawyers, and the regulators, and the journalists, and the scientists, and the executives. We know Frances Kelsey, and Widukind Lenz, and Harold Evans, and Herman Wirtz. The women at the center of the story, the ones in whose bodies the harm first became visible, the ones in whose kitchens the morning was ordinary, and the decisions were ordinary, and the bottle was ordinary, and the consequences were not, are mostly anonymous in the historical record, present in the aggregate statistics, present in the case files and the legal proceedings as plaintiffs identified by their conditions rather than their lives, not present in the way that the people who identified the problem and responded to it and legislated about it are present. This is the ordinary grammar of historical memory, applied to this story as it is applied to all stories in which the people who matter most are not the people with the institutional platforms. The grammar is wrong. The women matter more than the grammar suggests. And all we can do with that wrongness from here is to notice it, to say, the women were there. They were in their kitchens and their bathrooms and their doctors' surgeries and their pharmacies and their beds at night with the particular sleep of early pregnancy, heavy and deep and occasionally interrupted by the nausea that the morning tablet relieved. They were there. They are worth being named, even when we do not know their names. Let me end here, before the sleep comes, with the smallest possible version of what this story is. A woman in a kitchen in 1960, a tablet, the morning nausea quieting, the day opening. She did everything right. She trusted the people she had been given every reason to trust. She followed the advice of the systems that had been built in good faith by people with genuine intentions to guide her. The systems were not enough. The guidance was not complete. The harm found her in the gap between what the systems knew and what they said. And the world, slowly, imperfectly, at a cost that cannot be computed in any currency that does justice to what was paid, built better systems, required more testing, demanded more transparency, gave its Francis Kelsey's better tools and more authority to use them, enshrined in law the requirement not just that drugs be safe but that they work, and not just that they work but that the evidence be disclosed completely. The better systems exist. They are real. They are, in the specific sense of having been built from specific failures, dedicated to the memory of the women in the kitchens and the children who arrived differently than expected and the families who organized themselves around the particular child they had, rather than the child they had imagined. This is what endures. The bottle is gone from the shelf. The morning is quiet. The knowledge sits here in the dark beside you, complete and at rest. You have heard the whole story. That is enough. Let it go now. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. I've been thinking, while putting this together, about the women in these kitchens. The ones who never made it into the court records or the congressional testimonies or the histories. I'm curious what you think. Is there a pharmaceutical story from your lifetime that has stayed with you? Something you took or were told was safe that later turned out to be more complicated than the label suggested? Tell me in the comments. I find myself genuinely curious about how this history echoes forward into people's own lives. And now let us go back to the beginning. To the bottle, small, orange, ordinary, sitting on a bathroom shelf in a suburb somewhere outside a city, in a decade that believed in progress, on a morning that believed it was ordinary, the light through the frosted bathroom window, the sound of the kettle beginning its work downstairs, the particular quiet of a house in November after the husband has left and before the day has fully arrived. The woman who reached for the bottle each morning was reaching for relief, the simple, legitimate, entirely reasonable desire for things that hurt to stop hurting. The morning nausea quieting to something manageable, the day opening out from there into the ordinary things, the shopping, the letter to write, the walls that need painting in a colour not yet decided. It was ordinary. All of it was ordinary. The harm that was occurring was invisible, as certain harms are invisible at the precise scale of the individual morning. Let the room grow still now. Let the weight of the story settle where it belongs. Not inside you, but somewhere alongside you, at a respectful distance, acknowledged and at rest. The bottle is gone from the shelf, has been gone for more than 60 years. The systems that put it there have been changed, not perfected, they are never perfected, but changed, genuinely and significantly changed, in ways that matter for the people who come after. The women who took the morning tablet moved through their lives, their children grew, the world moved forward in the imperfect way that worlds move forward, learning what it cost, building what it could, leaving certain accounts unsettled. Let your breathing slow, let the morning kitchen soften at the edges, the cream-coloured counter, the floral curtains, the sound of the radio in the background, the smell of toast and tea. Let it become the kind of memory that belongs to a world that has passed, examined and understood, and finally gently set down. The baby is growing. The magnolia tree in the garden is bare and patient, waiting for the spring that is still months away. The November morning is grey and ordinary and entirely unremarkable in the way that mornings that turn out to matter always are until they do. You know the story all the way to its end now. That knowledge is enough. It can rest here in the dark and the quiet beside you. Sleep. The morning, when it comes, will come different from all those other mornings. You are safe. Good night.